The young man looked closely at the young lady and asked if she knew how to treat panthers. The young lady in turn froze in place without uttering a word. The young man quietly told the lady to answer the question. Trembling with fear, she said that she would cure the panther. He looked at her skeptically and said that they had been looking everywhere for months for someone who could cure the panther, but everything was clear. He looked at her with a cold gaze and said that if she was not sure that she could handle it, she could leave now. She looked at him intently and said that she was different from the others. Maria asked him to trust her and give her a chance. The young man nevertheless agreed. Since he had no choice, he said that if she made even the slightest mistake, she would pay dearly for it. The young lady said that she understood him and also asked if she could ask him for one thing. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he could grant her one wish if she cured the panther. He looked at her intently and said that he agreed and that she should start work immediately. A moment later, the young lady saw the panther in all its glory. The panther gracefully approached her and growled loudly. The young lady froze in shock as she was very afraid of her. The lady looked at her daughter and told her to take the order to the table near the window. Maria smiled and said that she would do everything. A moment later, she was informed that more visitors had arrived. The young lady looked closely at the guests present and served them with a smile. A moment later, the young lady felt dizzy as everyone called her name. After a hard day, she collapsed on the bench, breathing heavily, as she was very tired. Maria was very glad that the day was finally over, so she could sit in silence. Maria currently lived in Larson. But it happened completely unexpectedly since she lived her whole life in Korea. That day she found a kitten in a box. She looked closely at the little defenseless kitten and realized that she had to help him immediately. Then she took the kitten to the vet because she couldn't leave him outside on a rainy evening. But unfortunately, when she was slowly crossing the road, she heard a loud noise, and then she passed out. When she woke up, she did not recognize her reflection in the mirror. She found herself in Maria's house. The madam ran to the young lady as she was glad that she had woken up. Madam said that several days had passed since she fell down the stairs. Sir said with tears in his eyes that he was very worried about her. The young lady in turn was stunned as she understood that they were mistaken and that she was not really Maria. But what was surprising was not only that she woke up in Maria's body, she saw a small dog. She was a little puzzled because she realized that she could talk to animals. Maria looked at Borang and asked with a smile if no one else could hear him, except her. He ate slowly, and looking at her said that she was the only person who understood him. She looked at her friend with a smile and asked if he liked it. He slowly devoured her treat and thinking said that the treat was not bad. The young lady smiled and told her friend that he was very cute. He growled menacingly and told her not to touch him while he was eating. At first she thought she was going crazy, but nevertheless she had a lot of fun talking to animals. Thanks to her new friend, she was able to adjust to her new life as Maria. Sometime later, the young lady overheard the men talking about the crown prince. The young man looked at his companion and asked what had happened to the crown prince. The man looked at them intently and said that the crown prince's panther had stopped obeying him. The young people were surprised as they did not expect the crown prince to have a panther. The man said that the panther was tame and well-mannered. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately the panther had not been well lately and had not eaten for several months. The man said that the crown prince was very worried about his friend and ordered that every wall in the kingdom be covered with notices. The crown prince promised to fulfill any wish of anyone who could heal his panther. The young lady in turn froze as she realized that the crown prince was her gold card. She realized that if she cured the panther, she would be guaranteed luck, fame, and power. Maria slowly approached the young people and greeted them. She asked the man with a smile if it was true that the crown prince was looking for someone who could cure his panther. The man said that it was, and also asked if she knew of a good veterinarian in the area. She looked at the men with a smile and said that of course she knew, because she herself was a veterinarian in a past life. One day she woke up in a reality where she was Maria, and luckily she could understand the language of the empire. The lady looked at her daughter and said that they were her parents. Fortunately, the young lady could speak the imperial language fluently. She could also easily talk to animals. Unfortunately, she was still deprived of one opportunity. She was puzzled and did not understand why she could not read. She looked at her mother and asked what was written on the sheet and why there were so many people near the notice. The lady asked her daughter excitedly if her eyesight had worsened because of the accident. The young lady knew that her eyesight was fine, but for some reason she could not read. She later learned that the empire placed great importance on gender equality, giving women ample educational opportunities. Most of the townspeople could read and write, and she hoped that she could learn to read herself. The young lady understood that if such an opportunity was opened up to her, then she had to learn everything. But now she was perfectly aware that the path to wealth and fame was different. She knew that if she cured the crown prince's panther, all roads would be open to her. The lady looked closely at her daughter and told her husband that she thought her daughter wanted to tell them something. Madame approached her daughter and asked excitedly what had happened to her. Maria hesitated and said that she wanted to ask something. Mary looked at her mother and asked if she could go on the trip. Her parents were a little surprised and shocked by this question. The young lady in turn sighed heavily as she saw her parents' reaction and believed that they would not let her go. A moment later, her father said that she could go on her journey. She was surprised as she thought they would refuse her. The lady looked closely at her husband and asked if he was sure of his decision. The lady approached her daughter and asked with a smile if she had decided where she wanted to go. She said with a smile that the place was not far away. She knew it was a lie, but hoped that they would not ask questions. She knew that in order to cure the crown prince's panther, she had to go to Hardel, the capital of Larson. From Adelis to Hardel, it is 15 days by boat or by ship, about 3 or 4 days on horseback. But unfortunately, she had no idea how to ride horses, but she knew she had no choice. She knew that to return home, she would have to lose about a month. Sir looked closely at his daughter and asked when she planned to leave. She said with a smile that the sooner the better. He looked at his daughter intently and said that they agreed, but they had to discuss it again tomorrow. The young lady in turn slowly walked up to the room. She was a little puzzled since she was let go very easily. Maria knew she needed to check the boat schedule and buy some supplies. Rose looked at her sister and asked what she was staring at so hard. Not only is the rose as beautiful as its name suggests, it's also damn prickly. Maria looked at her sister in surprise and asked if she was really wearing her clothes. Rose said that this was not the case. Maria, in turn, knew that this was a lie. Rose pushed Maria and called her stupid. Maria, in turn, was surprised. When she first woke up in Maria's body, Rose was a kind and caring sister. With tears in her eyes, Rosa said that she was very worried about her. Maria was amazed as she thought that she was a very loving sister. The madam told her daughter to stay with her sister while she called the doctor. Rose looked at her mother and said that she would not leave her sister. Rose furiously asked her sister why she did not die. Rose screamed and told her sister to die. Rose asked her sister if she had really lost her memory and didn't remember anything. Rose screamed that Maria was ungrateful even though she was adopted. Rose screamed with rage because she wanted to get rid of Maria. The young lady in turn was amazed. She did not at all expect to hear that Maria was adopted. Rose told Maria that if she wanted to stay in the house, she had to lie low and keep a low profile. Maria grabbed Rose by the hand. Rose froze in shock as she did not expect such behavior from Maria. Rose looked at her sister with confusion and asked what she was doing. Maria looked at Rose intently and told her not to call her by name. Maria looked at her intently and told her to call her sister. Rose was furious and shouted at Maria that she was crazy. Maria looked closely at her sister and said that she could see that she didn't like her. Maria told her sister that she could continue to hate her, but that didn't change the fact that what she was doing was wrong. Maria froze in place as she didn't think it would affect Rose so much. Rose told her sister to shut her mouth and let her pass. Rose pushed her sister away in anger and Maria hit the wall. In turn, Rose fell to the ground. Madame looked at the girls in surprise and asked what was happening to them. She came closer and saw Rose lying on the floor. Maria looked at her sister as she understood that she was up to something. Rose looked at her mother with tears in her eyes and called her. The lady looked at her daughter and asked if she had hurt herself. She hoped that her daughter was okay. Maria froze in surprise but saw her mother approach her sister and ask if she could get up. Madame looked intently at Maria and called her. Rose looked at her mother and said that unfortunately it was her own fault. Maria was happy because she hoped that sister would tell the truth. Rose, looking down with regret, said that she shouldn't have taken her sister's clothes. She was just so beautiful and she couldn't resist. Rose said that her sister could have not pushed her down the stairs because it was too cruel. After her words, she looked at her sister with a smirk. Madame looked at Maria in surprise and asked why she did this. Maria, in turn, said that she did nothing. Madame froze in place, not knowing what to answer, as the situation was not easy. Maria looked at her mother with regret in her eyes and said that she could swear that she didn't do it. Madame sighed heavily and agreed with Maria. Madame looked at Maria and told her to just go and rest, and she would take care of Rose. Rose was in shock. She looked at her mother and screamed that Maria pushed her and it hurt her a lot. Rose was furious and didn't understand why her mother didn't protect her. Madame came closer to her daughter and said with a smile that Maria would never have done that to her. The young lady froze in shock. She didn't understand why her mother was telling her such things. Rose was very angry, and with lightning speed she decided to leave their company. Madame looked at Maria and said that Rose looked a little upset. Maria approached her mother and asked for forgiveness. Madame, looking at her daughter, said that everything was fine. Meanwhile, Rosa listened to their conversation. She understood that her mother loved Maria more than her. The young people froze in shock as they did not expect to see something like this. For a moment, they stared at the baby lying on their doorstep, Rose knowing that Maria had never been their real daughter. When she was a child, children would discuss their situation. They would say that Maria was the spitting image of her mother, but they did not understand why Rosa was not like her mother. They said that Maria was much kinder than her sister. Rose was furious and shouted that this was not so. Thinking about everything that was happening, she understood that she could never give in to her sister. The young lady walked slowly about her business and thought about this difficult situation. The lady looked closely at her daughter and said with a smile that she should be busy preparing for the trip. She told her daughter that she could go there and not worry about being ignorant. Maria, in turn, hoped that her mother would be more honest. And yet she knew that everything was fine now. She knew that she had support, and it was none other than her beloved friend Borang, who could always listen to her. She looked at her friend intently as he was very nice. A moment later, she greeted him with a smile. Borang woke up with lightning speed and looked at Maria with a smile. The young lady said with a smile that she had missed him very much. Borang said that they had seen each other recently. She smiled, a radiant smile, and said that she still always missed him. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he agreed with her. He looked at the young lady with embarrassment and said that he was also bored. It looked at her and asked if she was going somewhere. Maria looked at her friend in surprise and asked how he found out. He sighed heavily and said that he had just recently heard about it. Maria looked intently at her friend and, hugging him, said that she was going to Hardel on a visit. Maria said that Hardel is the capital of the empire and probably the most important part of this world. Her friend looked at her with bewilderment, but at the same time she realized that he looked very cute. She said that she needed to go there because the prince's panther was sick and needed help. The young lady said with a smile that she should go and help her. He looked at her intently and said that he understood her. Looking at Maria, he said that she would definitely cope, although he did not want her to leave. Maria said she knew she could do it. She looked at her friend and asked why he didn't want her to go. He said that unfortunately he would miss her very much, as he would be lonely without her. The young lady looked at her friend with embarrassment as she was pleased to hear such things. She hugged him and kissed him and said that she would be very sad at the thought of having to leave him. The young lady said with a smile that she would try to return as soon as possible and also thanked him for his kind words. Maria looked closely at her parents and said with a smile that she was already leaving. They stared into the distance at the departing ship. Madame looked after her intently and asked her to be careful. Madame spoke of her daughter that God would always be with her. At the same time the young lady enjoyed the scenery. She was surprised because she saw the beautiful sea and seagulls. Sometime later she saw dolphins frolicking beautifully. She was amazed by the beauty and all the animals that she came across along the way. A moment later she felt very ill and realized that she was overcome with seasickness. She was in shock because the trip was very difficult for her to bear. She wondered, puzzled, if there were no motion sickness pills in this world. The young man approached her and asked if she was okay. The young lady froze in surprise. He looked at her intently and asked if something was wrong. Maria looked at the young man and asked who he was. He smiled and said his name was Gerard, and he had just turned 20, and he was on his way to Hardel. He looked at her intently and apologized for scaring her. Gerard looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she seemed to be unwell. She timidly said that she was fine. Gerard came closer to her and said that she had a fever and was sweating, and so he concluded that she was seasick. He asked if she had taken her pills. and a moment later offered her a pill for the disease. She asked in surprise how she could trust him. Maria looked at him and said that she didn't know what kind of pill it was. She knew that she better be careful and not trust everyone. She looked closely at the young man who had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. She knew that something was wrong with him. He looked at her with a smile and said that he would drink one right now in front of her. The young lady was surprised because she did not expect such a thing. She froze in place as she saw him swallow the pill right in front of her. Gerard looked at the young lady with a smile and said that now she could trust him. A moment later, he handed her a seasickness pill. The young lady looked at him intently, but after a moment she finally agreed and took the pill from him. After she took the pill, she thanked him. Gerard said with a smile that there was nothing to thank him for. He smiled and said that they now had built up trust. She timidly said that they had just a little trust. He gave her a beaming smile and asked if she could let him know her name. Sometime later, they were sitting at the bar and having a casual conversation. She told him that she was 16 and this was her first time traveling. Gerard looked closely at the young lady and asked why she was so careful. He looked at her with a smile and said that she should tell him everything, and also called her Rose. She froze in place as out of all the names she chose this one. She looked at him intently and said excitedly that her name was Rose. She saw that he was still suspicious, and she couldn't take any risks. He looked at her with a smile and said that while she was there, she should definitely visit the Imperial Palace. Gerard said that even from afar, it looked so majestic and amazing. Gerard smiled and said that the garden there was very big and he always got lost in it. She said that he spoke as if he had already been there in person. He said with a smile that he has many cool and influential friends. The young lady looked at her friend intently and asked if this meant that he knew the Crown Prince personally. Gerard said with a smile that they were best friends. She said that then he should know what was bothering him most these days. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like the whole empire knew that Glick was very ill. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked who he was. Gerard looked at her intently and said that this was the name of his pet panther. The young lady froze in surprise. She was puzzled and wondered if he was really that close to the prince or if it was an elaborate lie. Gerard looked closely at his companion and said that Glick did not look like himself. He said that Glick was very angry and ate almost nothing. Even meat did not attract him, and he thought that he had something serious. He said that Einst was very worried about his pet. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise as she understood the prince's name. Gerard smiled and said that it was very funny, but those two looked very similar to each other. Maria asked in surprise if the crown prince and the panther really looked alike. Gerard said that they were very similar, not only in appearance but also in character. She thought it was very strange, since the hunters had told her that the prince was very handsome. He smiled and said that she seemed to be very obsessed with the panther and the prince. He asked if she wanted to show a little interest in him. The young lady said that she was quite irresistible to them, and Gerard smiled and said that she seemed to be feeling better. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that if she started to feel sick again, she should press on one point on her body. Maria asked in surprise how this would help. Gerard said that by pressing on this point, you can relieve the symptoms of motion sickness. Gerard said that if that didn't help, she should take another pill. She was surprised because he gave her too much. She was puzzled because the bag looked very expensive. The young man was very persistent and asked her to take a bag of pills. She said shyly that he should just tell her where she could buy them. He looked at her intently and said timidly that unfortunately they were not so easy to get. He said with a smile that one of his friends had made them especially for him. The young lady hesitated, embarrassed, not knowing what to answer. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she didn't need to worry because he was damn rich. She still agreed, but said that if he changed his mind, she would return it to him. The young lady froze in place as she had an unpleasant feeling, and she also heard someone's voice. He looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened since the young lady was not herself. Maria entered the room and was taken aback. She looked intently at the man who was about to hit the dog. The young lady looked at the man with fury and told him to stop immediately. The man looked at Maria in surprise and asked who she was. He looked at her with fury and asked who she thought she was. Maria said that she could not stand by while animals were being abused. She was furious and did not understand how he dared to harm such a small and defenseless creature. She shouted that she was ready to bet that this case was not the first. Everyone looked closely at the man and whispered. The man looked at everyone present in confusion and asked what she was saying. He was furious and shouted at her, but the young lady was not going to back down. He came closer to her and said angrily that she would certainly answer for her words. She asked in bewilderment if it was really she who had to justify herself. Maria looked at him with fury and said that everything was already clear to everyone. He looked at her with bewilderment. A moment later, a young lady approached them and asked what was going on. She looked at us in surprise at his companion and asked where such a crowd came from. A moment later, she saw her dog and ran towards it. The young lady was puzzled and did not understand what had happened to her baby. She looked at her companion and said threateningly that her dog was fine in the morning. The man was taken aback and said that she probably just got seasick. He said nervously that they had been at sea for a long time and that they themselves were feeling nauseous and dizzy. He came closer to her and said with a smile that the dog was already quite old. He looked at his companion with a smile and said that it must be very difficult for her. Maria, in turn, was furious because she knew that he was just a liar and she had to do something. The little dog was shaking and wanted him to go away because he was very scary. Maria came closer to them and asked if she could examine their dog. Madame looked at Maria in surprise and asked who she was. The young lady looked at the company and said with a smile that her name was Rose Llewellyn and that she was quite knowledgeable about matters relating to domestic animals. Everyone present looked at the young lady intently and whispered among themselves, wondering if she was the attending physician. They looked at her and said that it turns out she is some kind of expert. Gerard froze in surprise. Madame looked at Maria and asked if she could figure out what was going on. Maria looked closely at the beautiful dog and said that she was very stressed. She said dogs under severe stress experience vomiting and uncontrolled urination. Maria said that the dog licks itself often and also has bags under its eyes. She looked at Madame intently and said that all the symptoms pointed to severe stress. Madame looked at Maria in surprise. She said that it seemed to be her fault. She looked at her pet and said that she was very worried that she would be lonely and took her with her. The lady sighed heavily and said that perhaps she should have listened to her husband. The dog looked intently at its owner and barked continuously. She said that this was not so and that it was not her fault at all. Madame looked at her dog in surprise. She did not understand what was wrong with her. Pippi spoke about her owner that she wanted to be only with her and did not want to be abandoned. She also asked for help. Maria looked closely at the dog and asked if she could look again. Maria really wanted to help the poor dog because she saw that she was in very bad shape. The madam looked closely at the young lady and agreed. Maria thanked Madame with a smile for her understanding. At the same time, the little dog looked at Maria with embarrassment. Maria looked at the dog and greeted her and also asked if she could hear her. Pippi looked at Maria and asked how she understood her. Pippi shuddered as if she was not even its owner, but she understood perfectly well. The young lady looked at the dog with a smile and said that it would definitely help her, and she also asked what really happened. Pippi was with her owner from her earliest childhood. She was very happy because she had no one except her mistress. Then the young lady promised her dog that they would always be together. But after some time, the young lady introduced her dog to the new dad. Initially, he treated her very friendly, but over time he began to behave aggressively. Pippi was very afraid of the man and asked her owner not to abandon her. Pippi saw that the man was very aggressive and bad. The man in turn was very aggressive and careless towards the dog. He shouted furiously that it was precisely because of her that his wife did not want to have children. He wanted to deal with her immediately so that she would not interfere with his plans. Pippi was shocked and very scared because she knew he was trying to get rid of her. Maria looked at Madame intently and said that the dog was afraid of being abandoned. The lady looked at the dog in surprise and asked why they suddenly did this. Maria looked at her intently and said that all this was happening because of her husband. The man shouted that this was a lie. The man looked at his wife intently and said that this was complete nonsense and asked if she believed him. He looked at Maria with fury and asked who she thought she was. He said that she had lied to them about her abilities. Taking a glass of water, he wanted to splash it on her. He did not understand how she dared to do this to them. Maria froze in place in shock as Gerard blocked her with his body. Gerard said with a smile that he had arrived just in time. Maria looked at her companion with a worried and puzzled expression and asked if he was okay. The young man looked at her intently and said with a smile that everything was fine. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that the water helped him shine even brighter. She froze. Not knowing what to answer, Gerard in turn was embarrassed and timidly said that she should have understood everything. Gerard looked at her intently and with a smile told her not to waste her time on a man as she should not ruin her reputation. The man looked at the young man with anger and asked what he had just said. The man was furious and did not understand how Gerard could talk about him in such a manner. He asked Gerard if he knew who he was dealing with. Gerard looked at the man with fury and asked even if he knew who he was, so what? The man hesitated, not knowing what to answer. He was puzzled and Gerard's aura was pressing very hard on him. Gerard looked at the man with contempt and said that nothing would change the fact of his guilt. The man came closer to the young man and angrily asked what he was accused of and said that they had no evidence. Gerard looked at the man with a smile and named all his accomplices and also said that he had a photographic memory. Gerard told the man that he had seen him doing his dirty work before leaving, and at first he thought it had something to do with smuggling. Gerard looked at the man with a grin and said that it turned out that he was paying someone to get rid of the dog. Gerard told the knights to bring the men's accomplices to them. The young ladies shouted that they were not guilty of anything. They looked at the man closely and said that he had paid them and also told them what to do. The man froze in place, not knowing what to answer. The lady looked at her husband. She was shocked and did not understand how he could do something like that. The man shouted angrily and told his wife to shut her mouth. The man shouted at his wife that he did it for them. He asked if her mongrel was more important than their future. The lady froze in place in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing from her husband. She was shocked, looked at him and asked how he could say such a thing. The man shouted that it was all because of the dog, as it was preventing them from moving forward and having children. The young people froze in shock as they did not expect to hear something like this. Maria looked closely at those present and realized that the situation was really getting out of control. Pippi in turn looked angrily at the man. She knew that the truth would prevail. The lady looked at the man and asked him angrily what he was talking about, as she knew that the problem here was only with him. The man froze in shock and asked what she was talking about. The lady looked intently at her husband and said that he knew everything. She shouted that he was sterile. The man was shocked by his wife's statement. The young lady stared at the horizon. She knew that much time had passed, but her journey continued. After this incident, the man never showed himself to anyone again. A moment later, the young lady heard a dog barking. She turned around and saw Pippi. Madame and her mistress approached the young lady. Maria looked closely at the dog as she was glad that she was getting better. The madam looked at the young lady and said with a smile that, thanks to her, Pippi was much better. The madam thanked the young lady with a smile on her face. Maria looked closely at the madam. She was very pleased. Maria said with a radiant smile that she hadn't done anything special and that it was all thanks to the little dog. Madam looked at the lady intently and told her not to talk like that, as what she was doing to the animals was simply astounding. Maria, in turn, knew that Madame was telling the truth. She knew that in this world, many people adored their animals and took great care of them. The young lady in turn understood that unfortunately, there was never a good veterinarian nearby and the animals often suffered. She understood that for this reason, even the prince himself needed help. A moment later, Maria heard someone calling her and the voice was familiar to her. Turning around, she saw her new friend. He gave her a radiant smile and greeted her. She approached him with a smile and asked if he was bored. He smiled and said that he was. Maria, with a radiant smile, said that it seemed that geniuses thought alike. She asked how long it was to Hardel. He said with a smile that they were at least twice as far as they had traveled. She was shocked and couldn't believe it. He smiled and said that they would soon stop at the island of Terrace for a while. She was surprised, as she had never heard of such an island. He smiled and said that it was something like a gateway to their place, and a lot of ships passed through this island every day. He said that there was a lot of interesting things to do on the island, and a large selection of delicious food. The lady said that she couldn't wait to see the island. She asked if they could get off the ship and look around. He said it was possible, but it was always crowded and easy to get lost. He asked with a smile if she would go with him so as not to get lost. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted to go with her. Gerard said that he did. She smiled and said that it was a wonderful idea, but they still didn't have to go far. He smiled and said that it seemed like she was still cautious and thought he was dangerous. She looked away from him and said that she could walk alone. He firmly said that it was impossible, and the young lady in turn froze in place. He looked at her and said he liked that she was so careful. He quietly said he liked her. The young lady froze in shock. He timidly said that he liked her character and also liked that she was always careful. Maria smiled and said that she would definitely go with him. He was surprised and embarrassed. He looked at her intently and with an embarrassed smile said that she could rely on him. After some time, they arrived on the island. Maria was amazed by the beauty of the island. The young lady smiled and said that it was like being at a resort. Gerard smiled and said that he knew she would like it. He smiled and suggested that they have a good rest and try everything they could see. The young people walked slowly around the district. They enjoyed every moment. The young lady was amazed as she saw beautiful emeralds. She was shocked by what she saw. She said with a smile that she had never seen anything like it before. He said with a smile that they had come for a reason. The young lady smiled and said that she had gotten into a real adventure. He looked at her and said that for her this really was an adventure. She looked at him intently and said that it was a business trip as she had to meet someone and she would return home immediately after that. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that for that reason they might as well have some fun now while they could. She slowly walked away from her companion and said that she was very happy because they were creating wonderful moments that warmed the soul. Gerard looked at the young lady and said that they had better hurry so that they could see everything in one day. The young lady asked where they should start. She looked at him intently and told him that he should hurry up because she would leave without him. She said with a playful smile that the last one is the fool. The young man stared intently at his companion. A moment later, they were having a great time looking around the entire island. The young people were having fun because they saw various wonderful performances. They enjoyed a delicious meal. She smiled and sighed heavily, saying that it was not easy to have fun. The young lady wanted to take a bunch of photos to look at later, but unfortunately she knew that there were no phones in this world. She wanted to find some wonderful souvenir as a keepsake. He looked at her and said that they needed to be careful of tourist traps. He said that he knew of one place that was proven, and they needed to go there. He looked at her intently and said that they must make it back before sailing. The young lady agreed with him. A moment later, she saw a beautiful stray cat come to her. Gerard looked at her closely and said that there were plenty of them here, and this seemed to be their leader. She smiled and said that he was very friendly. Gerard said that it seemed to him that animals were very easy to contact with. Her Maria timidly and puzzledly asked if this was really so. Gerard said he had noticed this on the ship, and that animals seemed to recognize vets, and she laughed in bewilderment at this statement. After this incident, people began to approach the horses on the ship one after another, and eventually she began to look after the animals. It wasn't difficult for her to do this. The difficult part was to calm her pets who were delighted after meeting a person who understood them. Animals were constantly circling around her, and she began to resemble the Gomelpied Piper. Gerard said that they should feed the cat. The young lady said that she would buy meat since you can't give an animal anything. He asked her in bewilderment if she could handle it herself. The young lady smiled and said that she was already quite grown up. She said goodbye to him with a smile and left as she wanted to handle the shopping alone. Maria looked closely at the cat as she saw that he was pretending to be busy. She had the feeling that someone was watching her. She thought that the cat was very shy. Approaching the stall, she asked if they had any jerky without strong flavors. The man said with a smile that they had everything and also asked if one bag would be enough for her. She said that she would take 3. Maria smiled and said that she would pay for everything. Now she was glad that the man had everything she needed. She slowly reached for her purse, but a moment later noticed it was gone. She was in shock because her wallet was stolen right from her hands. Maria was in shock. A moment later, she shouted angrily after the man. She was in shock and asked someone to help her because her money had been stolen. A moment later, she shouted to her friend to help her and catch the thief. Gerard ran after the man with lightning speed as he wanted to help Maria immediately. The young lady in turn was breathing heavily. She had lost sight of the young people. Moments later, she saw a crowd of people and ran up to them, asking them to move aside. She froze in shock when she saw her friend beating the thief. Gerard looked at the young lady intently and said that she need not worry as he had caught the thief. Gerard looked closely at the young people and asked puzzled what to do with them. He approached her and asked for forgiveness for not warning her about the thieves. The young lady smiled and said that he was her savior and he had no need to apologize. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she was very glad he was there. He turned away embarrassed and asked if she could find her way back alone. The young lady asked him in surprise how he would get there. He said that he needed to hand over the young people to the overseers. She knew that the guards at the orphanage were like wardens in a prison. Gerard said that she could go alone and that he would catch up with her later and bring something special for her. He smiled and told her not to worry as he would catch up with her on the way. The young lady watched him closely as she hoped that he would return soon, but unfortunately, he never returned that day. She asked other passengers about her companion, but no one had heard anything about him. She knew that perhaps their paths would cross again someday, but now she had to meet the prince. The guards looked at the young lady intently and said they could not let her in. She asked why they wouldn't let her pass. The knight asked if she really thought they would believe her that she could cure the panther. They said she should leave before she got into trouble. She asked not to judge her by her appearance as she was a qualified veterinarian. Maria turned around because she did not understand why the knight suddenly became nervous. She froze because she saw a man. She was shocked and wondered how anyone could get past the guards so easily. The knight looked at the master intently and said that the young lady claimed that she could heal the panther and they tried to question her about it. The young lady was shocked because she knew that they were just chasing her away. The man looked at her intently and asked if it was true. He looked at her intently and asked if she had really come here to cure the panther. The young lady looked at the young man closely and said confidently that it was true. She said with a smile that she was the one who could cure His Highness's panther, and they could rest assured of it. The man looked at the young lady intently. He was skeptical but still thoughtful. A moment later, he told her to follow him. After a while, they were in the castle. He looked at her intently and said that she could make herself at home. The young lady, in turn, thanked him. She was confused because she didn't understand what was happening. The man looked at the maid and said something quietly to her. Maria looked intently at her companion and asked if His Highness was already on his way. He looked at her closely and said that this was not so because now they could not just take her word for it, and first they had to find out what she was capable of. He asked who she really was. The young lady smiled and said that she was an ordinary commoner and her name was Maria. He looked at her in surprise and said that she called herself a veterinarian. He asked if she really knew how to treat animals. Sometime later, the maid brought a dog into the room. The young man looked at her closely and said that she might be able to show her skills on this dog. He looked at the young lady intently and said that if she couldn't tell what was wrong with the dog or made a mistake in her diagnosis, she would face the consequences. He looked at the young lady with a cold gaze and said that if she had wasted his time uselessly, she would be punished. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the young man with a smile on her face as she understood that this was a test. She slowly approached the dog who was calmly resting. She saw that he was very lethargic and wanted to know what was wrong with him. She came closer to him and greeted the dog and also asked his name. Maria was surprised because the dog's reaction was not what she expected. She knew that as a rule, animals are very happy when they meet someone with whom they can talk. She asked the young man if the dog liked him. He looked closely at the dog who was resting and said that he loved to play ball and his favorite food was chicken. She came closer to him and asked if he wanted to play ball with her or try some chicken. After the dog heard about the chicken, he became very lively. The young lady was amazed as she saw that this was a very good reaction to her words. She looked at the dog with a smile and asked if he would mind sitting quietly while she examined him. He said that she could do whatever she wanted, but afterward she should give him the chicken. The lady in turn slowly examined the dog. She saw that he had no skin diseases and he was very well groomed. She did not see anything strange. She looked at the dog in surprise and asked why he was still lying on his stomach. She asked if he was in any pain. The dog sighed heavily and said that he was tired of everything since he was always being brought strangers who were constantly petting him. She asked if he remembered what they had talked about with him. He said he remembered and they told him that he was completely healthy but just lazy. Maria realized that this was a very good diagnosis. She looked closely at the man and said with a smile that the dog was fine. He looked at the dog in surprise and asked why he was so tired. She smiled and said that the dog was just lazy and didn't like to move. She looked closely at the young man and said that not all dogs are active just like people. They have their own characteristics and preferences. She said that the dog was completely healthy and there was no reason to worry. He looked intently at the young lady but said nothing. A moment later, he said that she had done a very good job and he would now take her to the prince. They slowly left the room, but she heard that the dog was very indignant because she promised him chicken, but he got nothing. She was puzzled and said that she would remind them to feed him later. The young lady slowly followed the young man while looking around the area. A moment later, they reached the door, and the young man said that the prince loved peace and quiet. He told Maria to speak when asked, and she should mind her manners and never cross the line. The young lady looked puzzled and said that she understood him. He wished her luck. A moment later, the young lady entered the audience hall. She was very happy that she would finally be able to cure the prince's panther. She hoped that everything would go smoothly. A moment later, Maria saw the prince in all his glory. The prince looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was the one who could cure his panther. The young lady stood frozen in place. She was in shock and wondered why no one had warned her that the prince himself looked like an evil panther. She was in shock because he had stolen her heart. She looked intently at the prince, and as his hair color seemed unusual to her, but at the same time it seemed familiar to her as it reminded her of her real home. The young man who stood next to the young lady coughed to bring her to her senses. A moment later, she greeted the prince with a smile and introduced herself. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she could cure his panther. Maria said with a smile that she could do it. She looked at him with a steady gaze and said that she believed she could. The prince looked at her with fury and said that if she was not ready for this, then she should leave immediately and not waste his time. The young lady looked at him intently, as just those few words were enough to tell her how tired he was of watching the failures that had happened before. From his reactions, she understood that he truly cared about his pet. Maria said that she knew that she could cure his animal. She said that he could rely on her. He looked at her intently and said that if she decided to take back her words and say that she couldn't handle it or that something went wrong, she would pay dearly for it. She said that she would handle the task, but he had to promise her something. She looked at the prince intently and said that if she cured his panther, he must swear that he would fulfill one of her wishes. The young man was furious. He did not understand how she dared to say such a thing to the prince. The prince stopped his subordinate and looked intently at the young lady. He said that he swears by Atra that he will fulfill her wish. She knew that people in this world believed in a goddess named Atra. They are convinced that by breaking the oath given to her, she will punish them with a curse that will haunt the entire family. A moment later, they passed the knight who was guarding the panther's chambers. The young lady in turn froze in place after seeing the beautiful panther. Mary knew she had to pretend she didn't know his name. She looked at the panther and asked the prince his name. The prince, in turn, looked closely at the young lady and said that the panther's name was Glick. Maria said that she needed to take a closer look at him. She tried to stay calm, but her heart was jumping out of her chest, and she was very scared. Although she was a veterinarian before, she had never had to deal with wild animals like a panther. She saw his posture and knew he was wary, but she knew she didn't need to be afraid of him. She understood that he was behind steel bars and nothing would happen to her. The young lady calmed herself down as best she could, but she was still very scared. She decided to pull herself together because she knew she shouldn't turn away. She knew she should make eye contact and move closer. She looked at the panther closely and greeted him smiling and saying that it seemed like he was talking to a human for the first time. She said that he had been eating little for the last few days, and the prince was very concerned about this. From his reaction, she understood that even though he was a wild animal, he recognized his master. She said with a smile that she was a friend of the prince and he wanted her to help him, and she called the prince by name. She was very much surprised when she heard her companion call the prince by name. She looked closely at the panther and asked if they could talk. He slowly walked closer to the bars and sat down. The young lady knew that he was reacting very well, and now she needed to find out what was wrong with him. She knew that now she had to find out why he was not eating well. She looked closely at her new friend and asked why he hadn't eaten anything for the last few days. She asked if he could tell her what was hurting him. Glick said that his mouth hurt and he could not eat meat. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that she had raised it. She was puzzled and wondered if it was the inside of his mouth that hurt. She was in shock and wondered if she should open his mouth and examine her. She was in shock because she was trapped, she was very scared, and she couldn't do it. She turned around and, looking at the prince, asked if they had tranquilizers. They looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what it was. She sighed heavily and said that it was medicine. A moment later, she was taken aback as she realized that it did not exist in this world. She sighed heavily and said that they should pretend that they did not hear this. She understood that she would have to examine the panther without outside help. She looked closely at the panther and said that she was actually a veterinarian and she was a doctor for animals. Glick looked at the young lady with distrust. She looked at him intently and asked if he could give her a chance. She said that he seemed to be very eager to eat juicy rare meat again. He looked at the young lady intently as this conversation about meat was very tempting to him. The young lady looked closely at the panther, for she realized that she had hit the bull's eye and the meat was good bait for him. She looked at the panther and said that she was the only one who could understand him, and if he trusted her, she would help him. She sighed heavily as she saw that there was no reaction. Maria said goodbye to him. He growled menacingly and told her not to leave. At the same time, the prince was watching his friend closely. The young lady came closer to him with a smirk and asked if he trusted her. She asked if she should ask them to let him out. She said that he had to promise her one thing. He looked at her in surprise and asked what he should promise her. She said that if he suddenly felt a little pain, he should not bite her. Glick froze in shock. He didn't expect to hear something like that. She understood that if she accidentally touched the sore spot, then naturally he would get angry. She knew that the wound that was in his mouth was very painful. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that her life was more precious to her. She looked at him with a smile and said that he must promise her, and only in this way could she help him. She saw that he was not answering and said that she should just leave. Glick sighed and said that he would not bite since he really wanted to get better as soon as possible. She asked with a smile if it was true. He growled at her with fury and asked how many times he had to tell her. The young lady looked at him intently with a smile on her face and said that she would now ask them to let him out. She came closer to the prince and said that the panther looked fine, but she should take a closer look at him. She looked closely at the prince and asked him to open the cage so that she could look at him carefully. The prince in turn looked at the young lady with distrust and skepticism, but a moment later he finally agreed. He came closer to the young lady and said that unfortunately he could not guarantee her safety. He said that the panther could tear her to pieces. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that he did not need to worry as this would not happen. He looked at her in surprise and said that she spoke with confidence. The prince looked at his subordinate and told him to leave them. Tahir looked at the prince in confusion. Tahir said that it was very dangerous and asked if he should call the guards. The prince looked at him and said that everything was fine and he could go free. Tahir began to object, but the prince was persistent. A moment later, the young man bowed and left. A few minutes later, the prince came up and slowly opened the cage. Glick came out and looked intently at everyone present. The young lady in turn slowly stepped back since she was still a little afraid of him. Maria looked closely at the panther and said that he must remember the promise. He looked at her intently and said that unfortunately, he could not forget about him. The young lady looked at the panther with a wary, intent gaze. A moment later, she came closer to the panther and introduced herself. He looked at her puzzled and asked what this strange courtesy was. She looked at him intently and told him to play along with her as the prince did not know that they had been talking. She knew that if she checked his mouth right away, it would be very suspicious. She checked him slowly, and a moment later told the prince that she needed to check his mouth. She looked closely at the panther and tenderly told him to open his mouth. A moment later, the young lady froze in shock. She noticed that he had severe stomatitis. She was a little puzzled by this problem. She thought for a moment, but later said that she saw a serious inflammation near the left molar. The prince looked at his friend in bewilderment and asked if everything was really bad. Maria sighed heavily and said that stomatitis was the size of her thumb, and it must be causing him great discomfort. She looked at the prince intently and said that they must cure him immediately. The prince looked at the young lady skeptically and asked how he could trust her. She looked at him in bewilderment as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her closely and said that no one had ever said before that a panther had inflammation in its mouth. She looked at the prince in surprise and bewilderment because she knew that a normal person would not climb into the mouth of a wild beast. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he himself saw that she tried to look at him carefully and he should believe her. She smiled and said that she had no reason to lie to him. The prince sighed heavily as he understood what she had said. However, he looked at his friend in confusion and asked what they should do now. Maria said that first they needed to prepare the ointment, but since it was for the oral cavity, they needed to find soft and non-poisonous herbs. She said that she also needed a stick wrapped in cloth. Sometime later, she was busy with the preparation. She was glad that everything was working out well for her, and hoped that as soon as she smeared the panther with this ointment, everything would go away with him over time. She looked at the panther intently as she wanted to get to work, but as soon as he opened his mouth, she became frightened and froze in place. She looked at the prince and asked if he would do her the honor of doing everything himself. Terrace asked in surprise if she was really asking the crown prince to do all the dirty work. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said that he could also participate in this process. Tahir looked at the young lady intently but did not answer. At the same time, the prince looked intently at his friend. The young lady was shaking with fear, but still said that she thought it would be better for the panther if his wound was treated by someone close to him. She said that the process would be very painful. The prince looked at the young lady and, taking the stick from her hands, went up to his friend. He looked at his friend tenderly and asked him to open his mouth. The young men looked intently at the panther as they were very worried about him. A moment later, the prince looked closely at his friend and praised him. The prince looked at his friend and asked the young lady how soon he would be fully recovered. The young lady sighed heavily and, looking at the panther, said that it would take at least a week. The prince in turn looked intently at his friend as he was glad that he was feeling better. The young lady in turn looked intently at the prince. She was very happy because she understood that she would finally be able to receive her reward. The prince looked at her and said that in that case she would have to wait another week. She froze looking at the prince. The prince said that he wanted her to look after his friend all this time. He looked at her intently and said that she should stay in the palace and do her job. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing, and she had no plans to stay in the palace. Maria was taken aback and nervously told the prince that this was not what they had agreed on. She said that he promised to fulfill her wish if she cured the panther. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said that she must cure the panther completely. He looked at her and said that he needed to make sure that his friend was fully recovered. He said that he didn't want to look for her everywhere in case something went wrong. He looked at her closely and said that it would be better if she stayed with the panther until he recovered. The young lady in turn understood that the prince loved his panther very much and treasured it. She saw that he was worried about it and wanted to be sure that his pet would fully recover. She looked at the prince with a smile because she understood that this was the correct thinking of a good master. The young lady stared at the prince and grumbled under her breath as she still hated him for the terms of their deal. She understood that she couldn't do anything about this situation anyway, and she could only agree. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that after the panther recovered, he should still keep his word and thank her. The prince looked intently at the young lady and said that he agreed. The prince stared at her for a moment, but a moment later he said that she should not even think about sneaking away until the panther recovered. The young lady smiled and said that she had never even thought of such a thing. She looked closely at the prince and said with a smile that it was a great honor for her to be near the panther and take care of him. The young lady woke up, and we were taken aback for a moment, for she was surrounded by maids. They greeted her with smiles on their faces and also wished her good morning. One maid asked the young lady what scent she wanted. Maria, in turn, was a little puzzled as she did not expect such a reception. She looked closely at the large assortment of fragrances. She looked closely at the maid and told her which scent she had chosen. Ever since she began living in the palace, the maids had spoiled her with royal treatment which she could never get used to. She was puzzled as it was too much for her. The maids surrounded her with kindness and care. Maria, in turn, was very puzzled as she was already tired of such care. She sighed heavily and said that this was too much. She didn't understand why they were bothering her like this. She wondered if this was really the norm for those who lived in the palace. Glick slowly licked his fur. Looking sideways at the young lady, he said that he was used to this. He said that people were afraid of him, so they treated him well. She was shocked by this statement and asked her new friend if this was all because she had cured him. Sometime later, Madame knocked on their door and said that the Crown Prince wished to see Maria at dinner. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock as she had never expected to dine with the prince. Madame looked at the young lady and said that the prince had asked her to join him. Maria froze in shock. She did not understand why the prince invited her to dinner. She wondered if he really wanted to grant her wish. The young lady stared at the entire table. She was in shock and did not know where to start her meal. The prince froze in place in shock as he saw a very amusing sight. He sighed heavily and asked if the maids had forgotten to feed her. Mary looked at the prince in bewilderment and said that this was not so and that the maids took good care of her. She asked why he thought so. The prince told the young lady that she was eating as if she had been starved all this time, so he became interested. He had never seen a person who was focused only on food when sitting in front of him. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what everyone was usually focused on. The prince looked at her intently and said that everyone was focused on him. Maria was puzzled by such a statement, but did not answer. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that usually everyone is already full after a couple of bites of food and they want to appear modest. Maria looked at the prince in bewilderment and asked how one can remain full after a couple of bites. Maria said that everyone just wants to look elegant and noble in front of the prince, and they spend all their energy on talking to him. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this meant that she didn't want to talk to him. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that the difference was that she had no goal to get anything from him except one desire. She looked at the prince with a smile and said that this was the reason she could concentrate on eating. The prince looked at the young lady with surprise and embarrassment. A moment later, the prince said with a smile on his face that he understood the young lady. Maria said with a smile that it was a pity that she had to wear that tight dress, as it was not at all comfortable. The prince said that he would see to it that they did not dress her for such occasions. He asked if there were any other inconveniences. Maria said with a smile that everything was fine, and Mrs. Merlin was taking very good care of her. The prince said that she could call her simply Merlin, and there was no need for such formalities. Although she occupied a high position, the average servant addressed her exactly like that, and her business was to serve Maria. The young lady sighed heavily and said that unfortunately she did not know about it, and also thanked him for telling her. He looked at her intently and said that ever since they met he had felt that there was something strange about it. The young lady looked at the prince in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. The prince, in turn, looked at her intently and said that she was very strange. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock. She did not understand what he was talking about. Looking at the young lady, the prince said that it seemed to him that she was not from this world. The young lady froze in shock. She didn't expect to hear such a thing from the prince. She wondered if he knew her secret. With a trembling voice, she asked the prince what he was talking about. The prince looked at the young lady closely and said that she had a very funny way of talking as she addressed the low-status staff formally, but spoke to him without any formality. The young lady in turn sighed heavily, for she thought that he knew who she really was. She was taken aback and asked him to forgive her and her bad upbringing. She asked if nothing terrible had happened. The young lady in turn timidly said that there seemed to be no problem. She saw that the tension was very strong between them. She looked nervously at the prince and asked if everything was okay. He sipped his wine slowly and, looking at the young lady, said that everything was probably fine. The young lady in turn was very tense and irritated. She understood that she needed to quickly change the subject. Mary looked at the prince and asked if she could find out how the panther became his pet. The prince said that he found him abandoned in the forest. The young lady in turn was a little puzzled as she knew that the panther was a wild animal and that it lived in the forest. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said that he heard the panther much better already. He asked what her secret was. The prince said that Glick was uncontrollable even with him until she came and performed a miracle. The prince said that Glick always behaved more aggressively towards strangers. He looked closely at the young lady and asked how she managed to cope with it. He said that she must have some special method. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she had a unique ability. The prince looked at her incredulously. The young lady in turn said with a smile that it was so and she could talk to animals. The prince froze in bewilderment. He looked at her intently and timidly asked what she could do. The prince looked at her with a smile and said that he didn't think she would say that, and he really liked her sense of humor. He asked if she really thought he would fall for it. The young lady in turn froze in embarrassment as she saw the prince's radiant smile. She said that she knew that he would appreciate her joke. She looked at the prince with a smile and said that she had gotten along well with animals since childhood. Maria said that she was constantly around animals, although her parents did not approve of this. Maria always wanted to become a veterinarian to take care of animals. She was very curious about how things were now in the veterinary clinic in her world. She thought that they had found a replacement for her after all, and she hoped that they had cured the cat she had found. The prince shouted and called the young lady Maria. In turn was taken aback and shuddered, asking for forgiveness, said that she was distracted for a second. She asked what he said. The prince looked at the young lady and asked if she had decided what her wish would be. The young lady said with a smile that she had already thought it over and decided, and also asked if he would keep his word. The prince looked at her with a smile and said that she was full of enthusiasm. He wanted to know what she wished for. 6 months ago, when she came to the new world to always thought about how to return back, unfortunately the young lady could not find the slightest hint on how to do this. She understood perfectly well that she could not give up this life either, so she decided to stay in this world and live during the day as she wanted. She really dreamed of opening her own veterinary clinics. Unfortunately, she lacked the funds for equipment and labor to open something good. She knew that if she could make animals happy, then this life would not be lived in vain. She looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that she needed real estate and significant financial support. She was beaming with hope. The prince froze in place from what he heard. He looked at her intently and asked if she was serious. The young lady looked intently at her companion and said with a smile on her face that she was absolutely serious now. The prince looked at the young lady with a cold gaze and said that he agreed and would certainly keep his promise. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. She didn't understand what was with his strange look. She wondered if he was angry because he would have to spend a lot of money on her. With lightning speed, the prince stood up. He said that the young lady could enjoy hospitality for now. He said that it would take several days to prepare a permanent place of residence. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and asked why she needed a new home. The prince looked coldly at the young lady and said that she should not misunderstand him since they were only connected by business relations and nothing personal. A moment later, the prince walked out of the dining room. The young lady in turn froze. She was puzzled and did not understand what had happened at all. She looked at the door in shock and wondered if it was just about money. She was shocked because she couldn't believe that he was so greedy. Time passed and their week with the panther came to an end. She looked at her new friend with a smile and congratulated him, and also said that he was finally getting better. She asked how he was feeling. Glick purred contentedly and said that all his pain was gone. The young lady smiled and said he was a great guy, for he had been through a lot. He purred and told her not to touch him because he was too hot. The young lady looked at her friend closely and said he was right. Maria said he probably didn't like walking in such heat. He said the prince was too busy for a walk. Glick sighed heavily and said that the prince needed him to always look after him. The young lady looked at the panther in surprise and asked if he really thought so. Glick answered and said that he did. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he thought so. Glick said that he then heard the conversation between the prince and Terrace. Glick said that the prince thought he was a cat. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked if he really thought so. She remembered the prince's story. He said that he found a panther in the forest. She laughed, amused by the fact that the prince actually mistook the panther for a stray cat. She thought the prince was just stupid. He looked at her intently with bewilderment. Sometime later, the young lady stood up and said that it was time for her to go. He looked at her in surprise and asked where she was going. "Were you really going to your own room?" The young lady looked at the panther with puzzlement as she realized that he seemed unaware that she was leaving. Mary looked at her friend and said that she meant that she was leaving the palace. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she should do that. She looked at him with a smile and said that she had finished her work and he was feeling better and it was time for her to go home. She smiled and said that today was her last day of work, and she also apologized to him for not telling him about it earlier. He looked intently at the young lady and said that she would stay. Maria looked at her friend in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. Glick looked at Maria and said that this morning when the prince was feeding him, he said that from now on she would take care of him. The young lady froze in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She did not understand what exactly the prince meant. The prince looked at the young lady closely and said that it was all true, as she had said earlier, that she wanted to stay, and he had granted her wish. Looking at the lady, the prince said that her chambers were already being prepared on the second floor, so in a few days everything would be ready. The young lady stopped the prince in a hurry and said that this was just some nonsense. She looked at the pensioner and said that she never told him that she wanted to stay in the castle. He looked at her intently and asked why they had to discuss it again. He looked at her angrily and said that she had said herself earlier that she wanted to become his concubine. The young lady froze in place in shock and embarrassment as she had never said anything like that before. His father, Operon, was alive and his uncle was the crown prince. His father had no chance of getting the crown, so he married Charlotte of New Britain. But since the crown prince had died in battle, his parents became the next in line to the throne. Everyone whispered as if they could not believe that the ruler was of New British descent. They said that it was really alarming and she could bring harm to the kingdom. The aristocrats claimed that the empress should be from the Larson family. His father gave in to the people's wishes and allowed Clopedia from the Larson family to visit the castle. From then on, everything started to change and get worse. Suddenly, for everyone, his mother died. Looking at the emperor, the aristocrats screamed and were indignant as they could not accept the fact that their crown prince would be a new British boy. The emperor looked fiercely at everyone and said that his son was the only heir, and he was not an ordinary child, he was the one who was worthy of taking the throne. The aristocrats expressed open support for Clopedia. Only his father insisted that he become the crown prince. His father was unable to cope with the grief of his wife's death and spent years alone but was pressured into taking a new wife. Clopedia became empress. The empress looked closely at the crown prince and said that His Majesty's health was deteriorating every day. She asked the prince if he was managing to cope with all his duties alone. The prince in turn said that he was coping well. He knew that no matter how busy he was with work, he could not allow the empress to interfere in state affairs. He had no doubt that she was capable of much with her influence. She looked at the prince closely and said with a smirk that he was mature enough to find a partner. She said that she was deeply concerned about his lack of interest in marriage. She said that she had someone in mind, and it would be nice for him to meet the lady. The empress chose her relative and vouched for her so that she could become his bride. The prince was shocked as he understood that the empress wanted to take him into her own hands. The prince looked intently at everyone present. He saw that the spectacle was beginning again. The young lady came closer to the prince and greeted him with a smile. The prince sighed heavily, looking at the empress. He was very tired of all this. He understood that they all wanted only power and fought with each other for it. He sighed heavily as this was very tiring for him. He thought for a moment as he had hoped that Maria was different, but as it turned out she was just as insatiable. Like all the nobles, the guy said that he would keep his promise and fulfill her desire no more, no less. He said that the limit had already been reached, and that was all. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and asked him in confusion what he was even talking about. She said that all she wanted was a small piece of land, a building, and some money, all the necessary conditions to treat as many animals as possible. She looked at the prince intently and said that this was the dream of her whole life. The prince froze in place from shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her intently and asked her in surprise if she really didn't know about the consequences of asking for a plot of land. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and confusion and asked what such a request could mean since she simply needed land, and she asked for it. They stared at each other for a while without saying a word. He sighed heavily and said with a grin that the land was the property of the imperial family, and it could only be obtained in 2 cases by being loyal to the empire or by becoming a partner. The lady froze in place in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her and said that she wanted a plot, and this implied her request to become his other half. The young lady was shocked by what she heard. She looked closely, but the prince, and nervously said that it was not so. She came closer to him and said that if she had known what it meant, she would never have asked for land. She looked at the prince and said that she never dreamed of becoming a concubine. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he had fulfilled the wish so easily, understanding all its strangeness. He looked at her and said that he had given his word that he would do anything she asked of him. She asked if he would have said yes, even if she knew all the details. The prince said that he did, but most likely he would never have visited her chambers. The young lady looked at the prince with tears in her eyes and said that she did not really need this land. He could just give her a little more money. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said with a smirk that it was too late. She looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He said that he had sworn an oath to Atre. The young lady froze in shock. She looked at the prince with tears in her eyes because she understood that she had fallen into her own trap, and at that time the prince, looking at her, smiled a tender smile. She was in shock as all her dreams were shattered into pieces. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that there was one way. She looked at him with tears in her eyes without saying a word. The prince, with a smile on his face, asked if she wanted to listen to him. Up with lightning speed and looking at the prince, asked what method he wanted to talk about. He smiled and asked if she would be okay with working as the imperial veterinarian. The prince said that the panther was behaving aggressively and the servants lived in fear because of this evil cat, but she was able to talk and walk with him without any problems, so he could trust only her. She hesitated timidly and said that she didn't mind looking after the panther, but living in the castle was too much for her. The prince said that he would pay her 300 gold pieces a month. He said that he would also grant her land building and money as promised, and she would also be allowed to bring and keep as many animals as she wanted. The young lady was shocked by such an offer. A moment later, she cried out, and with a joyful smile said that she agreed. A moment later, the prince's assistant brought the gold bars to the young lady. She was shocked as she realized that she had hit the jackpot. She looked at the prince with confusion and asked where she should sign. The prince looked at her intently and said with a smile that she should first accept his gratitude for curing his friend. He said with a smile that he looked forward to their cooperation. Sometime later, the young lady started signing the contract. She was puzzled because she saw many long words that she could not understand, but she just wanted to pretend that she understood everything. She knew that he could not scare her. The prince looked closely at his friend and said that he had already come to him. The prince smiled, looking at his friend, and said that they had not walked together for a long time. The prince looked closely at his friend, as he saw that he reacted immediately, which meant that he definitely enjoyed the walk with him. Glick slowly walked out of the room. He walked gracefully past the guards who shuddered at the sight of the panther. The prince walked slowly with his friend. After a while, the prince froze in place. He looked closely at the flowers that were next to the tree. In turn, the prince was sure that it was Maria who planted the flowers near the tree when she was walking with Glick. Sometime later, they finally sat down near the tree, and the prince felt his friend affectionately. The prince suddenly remembered the young lady. At first, he could not even imagine that such a fragile girl could cure the fierce beast. The prince remembered how the young lady confidently told him that she could cure the panther and he should rely on her. In turn, he wondered if there was a reason why she spoke so confidently that others usually shook with fear and wanted to run away at the sight of the panther, but she was not afraid of him at all. It seemed to him that even his friend was comfortable around the young lady. The prince was very disappointed when she told him about her desire to marry him. He remembered what she said later. In front of his eyes, she said that she would never have asked him for land if she had known about the consequences. The prince looked at his friend with a smile. He said that the young lady did not know about anything. The prince was very glad that it was just a misunderstanding. He looked closely at his friend and said that he had a feeling that she could give him even more joy. The prince looked at his friend and asked if he thought correctly. The panther, in turn, growled tenderly. The young lady looked at her new savings with burning eyes. Maria couldn't believe that she was so lucky she had already been paid a lot of money, and from now on she would receive a large salary every month. She said with a joyful smile that she had to share this fantastic news with her parents. The young lady looked at the maid and asked if she could bring her a pen and paper. The maid asked the young lady with a smile if she really wanted to send a letter. Maria smiled and said that she did. The maid said with a smile that she would bring everything now. The young lady in turn thought hard about the contents of the letter. She knew that it was better not to frighten her parents that she worked in the palace. Maria wrote that she was very lucky and got a job in the house of a rich family. She told her parents that she would stay in the city for a while. The young lady looked at the letter with a smile. She knew that all she had to do was send it. A moment later, she was taken aback, wondering how she could send the letter. The man looked at the young lady with a smile and said that they would send the letter safely to the right address. She looked at the man and said with a smile that if they answered her, he should tell her. The man smiled and said that he would definitely do so. The young lady in turn was glad since she had written the heel letter and sent the money. She wanted to walk around the town square a little more before returning to the palace. She looked around slowly, wondering where she should start. A moment later, she saw a sign that indicated the direction. Walking in the direction indicated on the sign, she froze in place. She saw a beautiful view. The young lady looked into the distance. She knew that even though she had decided to come here now, she needed to get out more often. A moment later, Maria heard a noise and froze in place. She wondered if she had misheard someone speaking. But a moment later, she clearly heard someone calling for help. She looked around tensely, but after a few minutes, she finally realized where the sound was coming from. She came closer to the cart. The young lady looked at the cart nervously. She hoped that there was nothing scary there. But a moment later, she saw a cute little bird asking for help. The young lady in turn looked at the bird in surprise and said that she would pull it out now. She looked closely at the bird as if she guessed who it was. The little bird looked at the young lady with a smile and thanked her for her help. Maria was amazed by the beauty and cuteness of this bird. She looked at it closely and asked excitedly if it was okay, and if she didn't like anything. The bird said that it hurt a little under its right wing. She looked closely at the bird's wing and noticed that the wound was quite deep. Maria looked at the bird in surprise and asked where she got hurt. The bird said that a huge bird had flown nearby and she tried to dodge, but it was too late, and pain pierced her wing. Maria looked closely at the bird and said that it must have been very scared. Maria said that she could help it get home. The bird said that its home was very far away and it didn't want to go there at all. Maria looked at the bird in surprise and asked why she didn't want to go back. The young bird said that unfortunately she had quarreled with everyone and didn't want to go back home. Maria looked closely at the bird as she looked very cute when she was angry. Maria looked closely at the little bird and said with a smile that she could go with her if she wanted. The bird looked at the young lady intently as her words pleased her. She looked closely at Maria and asked if she was sure she could go with her. Maria smiled and said that of course it was possible. The madam looked in surprise at the young lady who had arrived very late. Madame came closer to Maria and asked if she could find out what was on her shoulder. A moment later, the little bird began to fly away, and the lady became very frightened. She was taken aback as she saw that the bird was moving its wings. Maria looked closely at Madame and said that this was quite normal, as it was a living creature. Maria said with a smile that this was her bird and that it would be with her for some time. Maria looked at Madame intently and asked if she had the herbs she used to heal the cuts. Maria asked Madame to bring some. Madame looked at Maria intently and agreed with her. The young lady thanked the madam with a smile. In turn, Maria did not want to frighten her at all and mentally asked for forgiveness. The little bird looked at the room they had entered in surprise. She was amazed by the beauty of the room. She smiled and admired the beauty and said that it was 100 times better than her old nest. The young lady in turn knew that technically this was not her room. The maid looked at Mary closely and said with a smile that she had brought the herbs she had asked for. Maria thanked Linda. Linda smiled and said that she was glad to serve her. Maria looked closely at the little bird and said that she would now treat her wound and pinch it a little. Maria looked at the little bird with a smile and after a while said that she had done everything and the bird was holding up well. The bird thanked Maria for her help. Maria looked closely at the little bird as they had been together for a long time, but she did not know its name. She looked closely at the bird and said with a smile that her name would be Luri. Maria smiled, looking at the bird, and asked if she liked the name. She looked at Maria with a smile and said that she liked it very much. She told Maria that this was her name now, and she should call her by her name. Luri was very glad that she had received a name. Maria in turn looked closely at the bird as it behaved very nicely, and she was very glad that now she had a new friend. A moment later, Maria remembered that it was time for the panther to have dinner. She knew that she had to hurry, as he would be very upset if she was late. The young lady looked at the bird intently and asked her to wait in the room as she had something to do and would be back soon. Luri looked at Maria and asked where she was going. Maria looked at her bird intently and said that she needed to go to the panther she was taking care of, as it was already dinner time. Luri looked at Maria in surprise and asked what a panther was. Maria was surprised that the bird did not know about the panther. She said that it was a large and majestic animal. Luri gave Maria a radiant smile and said that she would also like to see it, as she loved everything majestic. With the speed of lightning, the bird jumped into the hands of the young lady. Maria was a little surprised and puzzled. Luri looked at Maria with tears in her eyes and asked the lady not to push her away. The young lady in turn was a little excited, as she knew that the panther could easily eat the bird. A moment later, she said that if Luri wanted to go with her, she must promise something. Maria told Luri that she must be with her all the time. Luri agreed with her. The young lady was positive she knew that she could protect her new friend. A moment later, she entered the room and greeted the panther with a joyful smile. Glick looked menacingly at the young lady. He said that she was late. Maria was taken aback and timidly asked for forgiveness. Glick looked at the young lady with bewilderment as he saw a bird on her shoulder. He looked at her intently and told her to hurry up as he wanted to taste the meat. Maria laughed timidly and said that of course she would bring everything. He growled menacingly and said that he wanted the meat quickly. She looked at him intently and said that they needed to talk first. Glick looked at her intently and said that he would eat the meat first and talk later. The lady slowly approached him and timidly held out the meat. Luri muttered to herself with admiration that the panther was very majestic and big. Glick looked closely at the little bird and said to the young lady that it looked like she had brought him a snack. Maria in turn shouted that this was not so. She was very puzzled and excited. She said that she had never said anything like that to him. Maria looked at the panther intently and was puzzled, but said that the little bird was a friend and they don't eat friends. Glick looked at the young lady intently and said that she should have thought before bringing the bird to him. Maria turned around in fear and looked over her shoulder. She was puzzled as the bird was gone. Maria looked excitedly at the bird, which was jumping happily and playfully in the panther's cage. Glick looked at the bird and said that it irritated him. He pushed it away and it flew head over heels. Luri, with a smile, said that she was having a lot of fun and asked the panther to play with her some more. Glick looked at Maria intently and told her to give him the meat right away. Maria in turn wondered if she was worrying in vain. Luri looked intently and with admiration at the sharp claws of the panther and asked with a smile if she and the panther were now friends. She introduced herself with a smile. Glick in turn said that he did not need friends. Luri looked at the panther and said that it was very boring to be alone. Glick looked at the bird in surprise and said that this was not true at all. The young lady looked closely at the animals. She understood that the bird was right and the panther had been lonely all this time. Maria watched them closely. She hoped that they would get along. Glick looked closely at the bird and asked Maria if she was sure that it was not a snack. Maria puzzledly said that she was more than sure. Sometime later, the young lady went to bed. She was very tired. She recalled with a smile the day that had already passed. A moment later, Maria heard the bird calling her. Luri looked at Maria intently and said with a smile that she had one question. She wanted to know why the panther called her a snack. She asked Maria if it was something good, since the panther always called her that. Maria was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. She just looked at the bird with a smile. She understood why the bird was not afraid when the panther called her that. Maria was a little puzzled and worried, as she understood that the bird simply did not know the meaning of this word. Maria looked closely at the bird and with a puzzled smile said that this meant that it was very pretty. Maria, with a smile, said that Glick was just complimenting her. Luri said with a smile that the panther seemed to like her very much and thought she was pretty. Luri smiled and said that unfortunately Glick was too shy to say outright that he wanted to be friends with her. The young lady in turn said that it was true. Maria looked at the bird puzzled. She knew she was starting to lie better. She was puzzled because she knew that a harmless white lie was the worst thing that could happen. Maria looked closely at the panther and said goodbye to him with a smile. Luri also said goodbye to her new friend. Maria noticed that the little bird really liked its new friend. Maria slowly approached her room and heard a strange sound. She did not understand what was happening. Maria saw Linda and another maid. She was confused and did not understand what was happening. Coming closer, she saw Qween. Linda shouted to Qween that it was she who broke the vase and also asked her if she understood everything. Qween in turn was trembling with fear and could not utter a word. Maria looked at the maids in surprise and confusion. She didn't understand what was going on at all. Linda walked up to the maid in a rage and angrily told her to answer immediately. A moment later, Maria entered the room and asked what was going on. Linda looked at the young lady in surprise as she did not expect to see her so early. Maria looked at the maid with fury and told her to answer immediately what was happening. Linda looked sideways at Qween and said that she accidentally broke a vase. Linda apologized to Maria for the clumsy maid. The maid trembled with fear. She looked at the young lady and asked for forgiveness. The young lady in turn looked closely at the maids, wondering if they really thought she would fall for something like that. The young lady sighed heavily. She said that she understood them and also asked to remove all the fragments as someone might get hurt. Linda looked at Qween and told the young lady that she would clean everything up. Now Qween began to clean up fussily. The young lady looked at Linda sharply and told her to clean everything up as she needed to talk to Qween. Linda was puzzled by this request, but still agreed with the young lady. Maria looked intently at the maid and said that they could talk by the window. The young lady in turn saw that the maid was shaking with fear. Maria looked intently at the maid and quietly said that she knew that Linda had broken the vase. Maria told the maid that she didn't need to panic. Maria told the maid that if Linda asked what they were talking about, she should just say that Maria asked her not to do it again and to be careful next time. Qween looked at the young lady with tears in her eyes and thanked her for her concern. Maria looked at the maid and asked her with a smile to bring tea and some snacks for the little bird. Qween smiled and said that she would do everything immediately. The young lady in turn sighed heavily as she had dealt with this problem. She understood that she needed to remember to scare Linda next time. Maria looked closely at her new friend and asked if something was wrong as she could see that the bird was excited. Looking out the window, she asked if Luri was pretty. Maria looked at the bird in bewilderment. Luri looked at Maria with confusion and said that she had said earlier that she was a snack, and she had said that meant she was good. Maria in turn was taken aback. She was puzzled and understood that she needed to watch her lies. Maria told Luri with a puzzled smile that it was so. Luri smiled and began to jump happily. Maria laughed puzzledly. She knew that she would have to explain to the little bird the true meaning of this word someday. The young lady in turn fell with a crash onto the bed. She was very puzzled and tired. She looked closely at her diary as she wanted to make an entry in it. Maria slowly made notes about everything that happened to her. A few days later, the young lady was walking with the panther. Maria looked around and looked closely to see if there was anyone nearby. Glick looked at the young lady in surprise and confusion. He did not understand what was wrong with her since she was behaving very suspiciously. The young lady knew that she had been lying too much lately, and she needed to replenish her energy. She was very glad that she finally got her sweatpants ready. She sighed heavily as she was very proud of herself since such pants were very difficult to make. In the process, she pricked her fingers many times and many samples had to be rejected. The young lady in turn was very happy because she succeeded in everything. After a while, she got ready as it was time to go for a run. Glick looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if something was really missing today. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Glick said that his snack was not available today. The young lady looked at the panther intently and asked with a grin if he was talking about Luri now. Maria looked at him intently and said with a smile that the bird was sleeping in its room. She asked the panther if he really missed her. Glick sighed heavily and said that it was not like that at all, and that he did not miss her. Maria looked at him intently and said with a smirk that he didn't need to say anything since she could read him like an open book. He looked at her intently and asked her if there was something wrong with her head, since she continued to dress so strangely. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that the functionality exceeds the design. She said that she could even bet that even the crown prince and the royal family, as well as the aristocrats, would go crazy over these pants. She looked at him and said that they would all want to wear them after one fitting. He looked at her intently and said that it was simply impossible and she could ask the prince herself. The young lady said with a smile that the prince was not with them now. A moment later, the young lady froze in place as she saw the prince. She looked at him surprised and puzzled and asked what brought him to them. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he had been looking for her and had been told that she was here. The young lady in turn froze in place as she was not very comfortable with him seeing her in such a form. He froze in surprise, looked at Maria, and asked what she was wearing. The prince looked at the young lady with bewilderment and confusion. He did not know what she was wearing. The young lady in turn asked for forgiveness as she was a little puzzled. The young lady in turn was very confused as she did not expect to see the prince. She realized that she was standing in front of him in an indecent manner. A moment later, she laughed and apologized to the prince. She said she was just trying on the running shorts. She said she knew they looked weird, but they were very comfortable. He looked at her in surprise as he had not expected that. The young lady looked at the prince with a smile and asked how she could be of service to him. The prince said that he had something to tell her. He looked at her closely and said that he had something to tell her but not here, and he invited her to come inside. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. She did not understand what he wanted to talk to her about. The prince looked intently at the young lady and said that he had one request for her. Mary looked at the prince in bewilderment and asked what he wanted to ask her. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said that there would soon be a royal ball and he would like her to be his partner. The young lady froze in shock and asked if he really wanted her to be his partner. A moment later, she asked if this was his birthday ball. He looked at her in surprise and said that she seemed to know. The young lady said it was. She looked at him hard and said there would be a line of people dying to dance with him. He sighed heavily and said she was right. The young lady was puzzled. She didn't understand what was going on and why he was worried. She looked at him intently and said that she was just a commoner, and besides, she couldn't dance. She sighed heavily and said that she was sure that she wasn't the best option for him. He looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that it was not so and his choice was final. The prince looked at the young lady carefully and said that she needed to listen to him very carefully. He said that he would like their conversation to remain between them. The prince said that the empress had a candidate for his future bride. The young lady froze in shock as she didn't expect to hear something like that. She didn't know what to say to him. The prince looked at the young lady and said that he was doing everything in his power to prevent this from happening, but if he was seen dancing with her this year, everyone would only insist on their engagement. He said that for this reason, he needed her help to prevent this and buy a little time. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that it would be impossible for the crown prince entangled in the web of politics to avoid marriage. She looked at him intently and said that she would definitely help him. The prince looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect her to agree so quickly. Maria said that she would help him only on one condition, and that he should do everything possible not to involve her in all the politics and other manipulations. The prince looked at the young lady intently and a moment later said with a smile that he gave her his word that this would not happen. He said with a smile that she could consider this her new task for which there would also be a reward. The young lady in turn beamed with happiness when she heard about the reward. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said with a grin that the amount of payment would depend on the results of her work. He said with a smirk that she had a week to learn the dance that she would perform with him. The young lady in turn froze in place in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The prince looked at her with a smile and said that they could start right now. Maria froze in shock and couldn't utter a word. She didn't know if she could handle it. She was puzzled because she knew she should have guessed this. She should have given up when she still had the chance. A few days later, she trained non-stop. Madame looked at the young lady intently and said that they could end their lessons there. Maria, in turn, was in shock. She collapsed to the ground from helplessness. As she left, Madame said that they would meet at the same time tomorrow. She told the young lady to never stop practicing, and she should go over all the movements in her head constantly. Maria, with a trembling voice, said that she understood her and would do everything. Maria was in shock. She was very tired. If she had known earlier that everything would happen like this, she would never have accepted the prince's offer. Luri P flew up to the young lady and in a trembling voice asked if she was okay. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was perfectly fine, just tired. Luri looked at the young lady and said that she didn't think she was okay. Maria sighed heavily and said that these workouts were really exhausting and she was very tired. She was puzzled and falling asleep. She knew that she shouldn't sleep and needed to go back to her room. Some time later, the young lady jumped up with lightning speed as someone was continuously calling her. The maid looked at the young lady and said with a smile that it was time for dinner. Maria was surprised and asked if it was time to go already. A moment later, she froze as she saw a blanket in front of her. Maria looked at the maid and asked if it was she who had hidden her. Chloe looked at the young lady in bewilderment and said that it was not so. Maria looked at her Luri and asked if she knew who did it. Luri in turn said that she also dozed off. Chloe looked closely at the young lady and said that perhaps another maid did it. The next day, the young lady also learned the dance. It was difficult for her, but she knew she had to do her best. A moment later, the young lady saw the crown prince and Maria froze in surprise. Maria looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was doing here as she had not expected to see him. Madame looked at the young lady and said with a smile that His Highness had asked her to rehearse the movements with him today. The prince came closer to her and asked if she would allow him to do this. Maria froze in place but still agreed. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if they could begin. Mary agreed and they began to dance. She was puzzled as it was all unexpected and she was not prepared for it. They danced in silence for some time, the young lady in turn looking intently at the prince. She was surprised and embarrassed, as it was easier for her to dance with him than alone. She was a little angry because she knew it was just not fair, since not only was he handsome, but he was also a good dancer. While looking at the prince, Maria accidentally stumbled. The prince managed to catch her and pulled her towards himself, but unfortunately it so happened that they fell. The young lady noticed that the prince had softened her fall and nothing hurt her, but she noticed something strange. She froze in shock because when she opened her eyes, she saw that she was close to the prince. She was shocked by the realization that she had kissed the prince, and with lightning speed, the young lady jumped away from the prince. Madame quickly ran up to the prince and asked if he was okay. She was fussing. The prince looked at Madame and said that he was okay, and there was no need to worry about him. The prince looked at the young lady and asked if she was okay, and Maria in turn said sheepishly that she was fine. He looked at the young lady closely and said that this often happens during the dance, so she should be careful. The young lady looked at the prince with embarrassment. She wondered if he was worried about her. This was unexpected for her. He looked at her intently and said that they could not allow such a thing to happen on the day of the ball under any circumstances, otherwise they would become a laughingstock for the entire empire. The young lady was shocked as she realized that he was not worried about her, but about his reputation. The prince said they needed more practice. He looked at the lady and said she could continue. Lady Cecile said she would do her best. Maria, in turn, looked intently after the prince. She was a little puzzled by everything that had happened. The prince slowly returned to his office, thinking about the young lady. He remembered entering the room and seeing a young lady sleeping peacefully. The prince laughed when he saw the sleeping young lady. Tahir looked at the prince in surprise and asked what could have made him so happy. The prince looked at his friend and told him to be quiet, and also went and asked the maids to bring a blanket. The young man looked at the prince in bewilderment, as he did not understand why he needed a blanket, but he still agreed. The prince approached the young lady, who was snoring peacefully. He thought that the dancing lessons had really worn her out. He looked closely at the young lady because he knew that she was unusual. He was surprised that she had fallen asleep on the sofa so easily. He knew that he simply could not leave her for a second. The prince came to the young lady to practice dancing with her since there were only a few days left before the ball. Maria, in turn, looked at the prince with bewilderment. A moment later, she asked if he was practicing with her again. Today, Madame looked at the young lady intently and said that it was so since the dance was not meant to be performed solo, and it was best for two people to practice together so that they would get used to each other. The young lady in turn was a little puzzled as she was afraid that she might fall again. The prince looked at the young lady and said that they could begin. He said he wanted to talk about yesterday. The young lady was taken aback and said it was a pure coincidence. The young lady said sheepishly that unfortunately she had tripped and fallen. She asked the prince for forgiveness for what had happened. She said that she was fine and she didn't care at all. The lady in turn looked intently at the prince. She was puzzled by this situation and could not think of anything except this incident. He frowned at her and said that it was just an unfortunate accident and that they should forget about it. The young lady in turn looked at the prince with embarrassment and said that it would be better that way. The prince looked at the young lady, and a moment later turned his gaze to the little bird that was sitting on her shoulder. He looked at it in surprise and said that he seemed to have seen it somewhere before. The young lady smiled and said that it was a long-tailed tit that she had picked up a few days ago, and her name was Luri. Luri looked at the prince intently and greeted him with a smile, saying that she was very pleased to meet him. But in turn, the prince saw that she was only chirping. He looked closely at the little bird and said that she was very talkative. Mary said with a smile that it was very sweet. She asked the prince if she was speaking truthfully. The prince looked closely at the little bird and said that he was not a particular bird lover. Luri looked at Maria and said that the prince looked very much like a panther. Maria looked at Luri in surprise and asked if that was really true. Maria thought for a moment with a smile on her face, as she knew that they were both prickly on the outside but kind on the inside. The prince looked sideways at the young lady and asked if they would begin. The young lady was taken aback and said that of course they would. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that unfortunately there would be no practice tomorrow, so they had to give it their all today. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked why there would be no practice tomorrow. The prince said that he had arranged a meeting. The young lady was taken aback but said nothing. He looked at her intently and said that there were some people who really wanted to help her. The next day, the young lady came forward. She looked at the married couple with a smile and said that she was very glad to meet them, and she also introduced herself. The man looked at the young lady intently and greeted her with a smile and said that they were very glad that they could finally meet her. Madame smiled and said that she hoped the young lady had a good journey to them. The young lady looked at Madame and said with a smile that she had prepared something for her. Maria hoped that she had not made any mistakes, yet she was very nervous. Madame looked intently at Maria and thanked her. The madam came closer to the young lady and asked with a smile if she could call her simply Maria Maria. With a smile said that of course she could. The man looked at the young lady intently and said that unfortunately he had to leave now, but they could have fun. Madame looked at the sea with a smile and said that she must sit down as they had much to talk about and it would take some time. Madame looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she had heard that Maria was going to go to the ball with the crown prince. Madame said that unfortunately she was very worried about Lady Winston's reaction to this. Maria looked at Madame in surprise. Madame looked intently at Maria and said that everything they would talk about today should not go beyond this room. Maria looked intently at Madame and said that she understood everything and would not tell anyone anything. Madame said that for a very long time the Empress had been trying to marry Rosalie Winston to His Highness, but the Crown Prince had always rejected this proposal. Madame said that Lady Winston had been intimate with the Empress for a long time, and she would take away a great deal of control over the empire if this marriage took place. Madame said that in that case His Highness's influence would be significantly less. She sighed heavily and said that so far everything was going well, and to make sure that everything would continue to be, so they needed to continue to provide any support to His Highness. The young lady looked at Madame intently and said that she completely agreed with her. Madame looked at Maria intently and said that for this reason, the members of the Marquis's house would take her under their guardianship. Maria was surprised, as she had not expected to hear something like that at all. Madame looked closely at the young lady and said that it was exactly like that, and after all the Crown Prince himself had asked them about it. Maria was shocked as she did not expect to hear something like this. She was touched by the Crown Prince's concern. The madam looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that the Crown Prince must have valued her very much. The Marquis said that no one knew what the future held for the two of them. Maria looked at Madame with bewilderment and shock. Madame was taken aback and looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she had made a mistake. Madame said that she was overwhelmed with different thoughts since Maria remained to live in the palace. Maria sighed and said sheepishly that she was in the palace now, but there was another reason for that, and it was a very long story. Maria began to tell the whole story from the very beginning. Madame was taken aback after hearing everything. She hesitated and said that now everything became clear to her. The Marchioness looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile what she could do for her as her patron. She handed her a letter and said that she was organizing a private meeting and would like her to be present there as well. The Marquise looked closely at the young lady and said that there would be influential ladies at the event, and therefore it would be to her advantage to get to know them. The young lady said, puzzled, that unfortunately she was a little hesitant, as she was afraid that she might embarrass herself in front of them. The madam looked at the young lady intently and said that she had nothing to worry about. After she rang the bell, a servant entered the room with documents. Maria in turn froze in shock. She did not understand what was happening. The young man looked at Madame and said with a smile that he had brought the documents she had asked for. The Marquise thanked him. Maria looked at the documents in surprise and wondered if this was all for her. She was shocked and couldn't believe it. The Marquise looked at the young lady and said that unfortunately she understood that there were too many of them, but she could not do anything. The young lady puzzledly said that there were only a few. Maria puzzledly asked what they were for. Madame looked at the young lady intently and said that she had prepared everything about royal etiquette for her and had also collected detailed information about the meeting participants down to the smallest details, including their status and connections with other families. The young lady in turn froze in place. From the realization that she needed to study all of this, Madame looked at Maria with a radiant smile and said that she sincerely hoped that the nth lady could absorb everything. Maria looked at Madame with bewilderment and asked how she should thank her. Maria, in turn, drooped as she realized that she had a lot to learn. She was in shock because she realized that they were burdening her with complete, in addition to the excruciating dance lessons, she also had to study all the documents. Maria came to Glick. She sat down next to him and greeted him. He looked at her intently and said that she was showing an unusual level of enthusiasm right now. She looked at him in surprise. The young lady in turn was very much puzzled as she knew that she would have to reread everything again tomorrow, as there was only one day left before the meeting. Luri looked at the young lady with a radiant smile and said that she would definitely cope with everything. Maria looked closely at her friend and thanked her with a smile for her support. She looked at Glick and Luri and asked in surprise when they had managed to become so close. Glick nervously told Luri to get off his head, but Luri did not listen. Glick looked intently at Maria and said that this was not at all true. Luri P. looked at Maria and said that they probably became closer when she found out that Maria had lied to her. Maria looked at the bird in bewilderment and asked when it had lied. Luri looked at the young lady with fury and anger and said that she was the one who lied to her. She said that the snack did not mean that she was pretty. Glick looked at Maria intently and said that it did, and she lied. They looked at Maria intently and both said that she was a pathological liar. The young lady in turn was greatly puzzled as she realized that she had been caught. She came closer to the little bird and puzzled asked for forgiveness. She was sad that she had to lie. Then Luri looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that everything was fine. She said that she and Glick understood everything. He looked at her in surprise and asked if he really understood. Luri looked at her friend and told Maria that he said that she lied to her because she didn't want to hurt her feelings. The young lady in turn looked closely at her friends. She had been very busy lately and could not pay much attention to them. Maria understood that Luri had been visiting Glick often lately. Glick was shaking and telling Luri that he asked not to tell anyone about this. Luri, with tears in her eyes, asked her friend for forgiveness as she had forgotten about it. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at her friends. She was very glad that they had become such good friends. A moment later, the knight entered the room and, looking at the young lady, said that His Highness required her presence. Maria, in turn, was surprised because she did not understand why the prince wanted to see her. The crown prince looked at Maria intently and said that he had heard that she had received an invitation to an important meeting. The young lady in turn said that this was true. The prince said that the young lady must have liked the marquise very much. He also asked when the meeting would take place. Maria said that the meeting would take place tomorrow. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect the meeting to take place so soon. He asked if she was going to go there. The young lady in turn timidly said that the meeting was very soon, but she had received an invitation, so she had better go there anyway. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that he understood her, and he also asked her not to forget to dress appropriately. He said that she should make every effort to look her best. The young lady in turn agreed with him with a smile. He looked at her closely and said that the dress she had worn last night for her dance lesson would be a good option. The young lady in turn froze in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, her face changed, and with a smile she asked if this meant that he liked the dress. She was surprised, and she liked his reaction. She had never seen him so excited. The young lady in turn continued to tease him, but suddenly froze in place as she saw that he was angry. She was agitated and wondered if she had really finished joking. She looked timidly but the prince and said that she was just joking. The prince in turn looked closely at the young lady and said that she looked charming in this outfit. Maria froze in place as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Maria froze in place from embarrassment, not knowing what to say. At the same time, the prince timidly said that it was just politeness. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she thought so. The prince told Mary that she had missed class today. The young lady looked at the prince and said that unfortunately that was true. He looked at her with confusion and asked if she wanted to try rehearsing their dance right now. The young lady in turn looked at the prince with confusion, but still agreed. She was puzzled because her heart was beating very loudly. The prince slowly approached the young lady and offered her his hand. They stared at each other for a moment, their hearts beating in unison. The prince looked at the young lady with a beaming smile and said that she had become a better dancer. She looked at him shyly and said with a smile that she had practiced a lot. Mary looked at the prince with a puzzled expression and asked if there was anything she should know before the next day. He shook her hand even more firmly and looking at the young lady said that she would be introduced as a distant relative. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she did not need to worry about anything, as everything would go perfectly. Maria looked at the prince with a smile and sheepishly told him not to worry, as she would play her part perfectly and would not disappoint him. The young lady bowed slowly after the dance was over. The prince looked at her intently and said that he was not worried at all. The prince said he had no doubts about her. He looked at her intently and with a radiant smile said that he was sure that she would certainly cope with her task. The prince sat and looked closely at the documents. He was a little puzzled by this situation. He knew his father's illness began with insomnia, followed by headaches and back problems. Despite the doctor's efforts, his condition only worsened, and in despair, he began calling doctors from everywhere, but no one could cure him. Unfortunately, no one was ever able to determine the cause of his illness, and he became dependent on medication. The drugs were so strong that they damaged his mind, and unfortunately, the wisest man in the empire turned into an overly sensitive and aggressive person who became more and more mentally unstable with each passing day. The crown prince then had to take charge of state affairs. Yuta, the half-brother, was too young for such work, and while his mother was around, he couldn't risk involving him in all this. The prince looked out the window as he saw that it was raining heavily, and he was interested in how the young lady was doing. He remembered her radiant smile and the way she told him that he didn't need to worry because she would be fine. He smiled because he was sure that she was fine. The assistant came to the prince's office and said that he had come to give him information. Tahir looked at the prince in surprise as he did not understand why he was smiling for no reason. The prince looked intently at his assistant and said that he was listening to him. Tahir looked at the prince in surprise and said that his behavior in recent days seemed rather unusual, since before he had not noticed the prince touching his lips so often. The prince decided not to develop this topic, and looking at the documents told his assistant that Maria had gone to have tea with the marquise. Tahir looked at the prince and said that he understood him perfectly well, that he was very worried. The prince smiled and said that he was sure that the young lady was having a wonderful time. Tahir looked at the prince and said that it seemed that His Highness treated her with great respect as the circumstances required. The prince said with a smile that the young lady had earned his trust, and in exchange for her help at the ball, she asked him for a favor. The assistant looked at the prince in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The prince said that Maria asked for guardianship because when people noticed that a woman under Dimitri's guardianship was dancing with him, there would be talk. The prince smiled and said that it seemed like the young lady was thinking ahead a couple of moves. The young lady looked at the estate with a smile, as she noticed that it was very beautiful. The Marchioness looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she completely agreed with her, as this was simply the perfect place for tea. The young lady slowly began to count the instruments. She noticed that 4 more people were about to join them. The Marquise looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that in about half an hour all the other guests would arrive. She told Maria that she had asked her to come early to tell her something. Maria looked at the Marquise in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The Marquise looked at Maria intently and smiling told her to imagine that she was one of the aristocrats. The Marchioness looked at the young lady with a smile and asked her to talk to her about something. Maria looked at the Marquise in surprise. She hesitated, not knowing what to start the conversation about, but a few moments later she finally collected her thoughts and began to talk to the Marquise. Madame looked at the Marquise and said with a smile that she did not know that she had such a charming and sweet niece. Maria looked at everyone present with a smile and said that after she managed to cure the panther, His Highness, she began working as a royal veterinarian. She was glad because she knew that the polite greetings had been passed in the degree of the angle of rotation of the mug in relation to the hand passed. She knew that she had only one thing left. The young lady looked intently at the madam who sat next to her. Maria looked at her closely and said with a smile that her pendant sparkled so beautifully. Maria smiled and said that it suited her very well. The madam looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if it was true. The madam said that usually girls her age are not very attentive to details. Maria, in turn, looked at Madame with a smile but did not answer. She was glad that everything went as it should, since they had said earlier that Madame really loved compliments. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked if he was feeling ill. Luri looked at Glick and asked if he was okay since she saw his puzzled face. He sighed heavily and turned away from them. A moment later, he said that he was completely healthy. Maria looked at him in surprise and asked why he did not finish his meat. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he was not particularly hungry. Maria was surprised as she did not expect to hear something like that. She looked at him intently and said sadly that he looked very depressed today. She asked excitedly what happened. He sighed heavily and said that a few days ago Ines promised him that they would finally be able to go for a walk for the first time in a long time. But today, when he was feeding him, he said that he had to cancel everything. Glick was very upset. The young lady looked out the window. She thought that the prince had to cancel everything because of the weather. She looked at Glick closely and said that the prince must have put everything off because of the rain. Glick sighed heavily and said that this was not so, since the prince said that something had happened to him and now he was very busy. Maria looked at the gift intently. She didn't know how to console him. A moment later she said with a smile that they could play some game. Glick looked at her in surprise and asked what game she was talking about. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that they could play a word game. She said that she could explain everything to him with an example. Maria said that she would say the word meat, and he would have to say a word that began with O. Sometime later they started playing this game. Maria looked at the panther intently. She was surprised because she thought he was in a bad mood. She couldn't believe that he started answering her so quickly. A moment later she said a word. He looked at her in surprise and said that she could not make up words. The young lady in turn sighed heavily, since this word she often used in her world. Maria realized that it didn't matter that much now, since she saw that his mood had improved. The young lady was a little puzzled, as she understood that the prince was very busy. She was sure that he would like to spend more time with his friend. The young lady thought for a moment that in just a little while she would finish the gift for the prince. The young lady glanced sideways at Luri and asked if everyone had left. She slowly flew up to Maria and said quietly that everyone had left. After the young lady was left alone in the room, she slowly began to prepare a gift for the prince. A moment later, she pricked herself very hard, and blood started to flow in all directions. She screamed as if it was very painful for her. Luri looked at the young lady with a puzzled look and asked if she was okay. Maria laughed shyly and said that everything was fine, and she was fine. The young lady also sat and prepared a gift for the crown prince the next evening. She also did not forget to talk to her bird. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked if everything was okay with her as she saw that she was extremely tired. Maria smiled and said that she was completely fine. After completing the meticulous work, the young lady beamed with happiness, as she was very glad that she had managed to complete the gift for the crown prince on time. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she had called her. Maria picked up the box with a smile and showed it to the maid. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise. A moment later, the maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was finally finished. The maid was surprised because she knew that Maria had put a lot of love into this thing. Mary looked at the maid and said with a smile that this was so, but she also asked to keep it a secret. She looked at her and said with a smile that she would soon find out about everything. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked with a smile who it was, for Maria smiled and said that she had prepared it for the crown prince. The maid thought for a moment and said that she understood everything. Maria looked at the maid intently and asked if she could find something to tie the box with. The maid smiled and said that she would certainly prepare everything. A moment later, she walked slowly out of the room. The maid looked intently at Qween and called her. Qween jumped, not expecting to see anyone. Linda looked at Qween intently and asked grimly what she had asked her to do. Qween was momentarily confused and timidly said that Milady had called her Linda, looked at Qween in surprise, and said that Milady was sleeping now. Qween was confused. She didn't know what to do since she was asked to keep everything a secret. Linda looked at Qween with a smirk and asked what she was doing in the room at such a late hour. Qween started to say that the young lady had called her Linda, looked at the maid with fury and told her to stop using the young lady as an excuse. A moment later, Maria came out of the room and told the maid to stop. Linda looked at the young lady in surprise as she did not expect to see her at such a late hour. Linda shuddered as she looked at the young lady as she gave off a very menacing aura. Linda looked at the young lady puzzledly and said that she didn't know the young lady was here. Mary looked intently at the maid and said that now she knew. Linda said furiously that Qween had completely gotten out of hand and that she still hadn't completed her assignment. The lady in turn sighed heavily and looking at the maid said that it was she who called Qween. Maria looked at her intently and said that not respecting Qween meant not respecting her. Linda was taken aback and in a trembling voice said that she had not meant that at all. Qween looked timidly at the young lady and called her Maria in turn, looked closely at the maid and wondered if this was too much for her. She was confused because she knew she couldn't just stand by and let her bully Qween. She knew perfectly well that Linda was a good person. She was like an open book, predictable, and not stingy with emotions. Maria looked closely at the maid. She knew perfectly well that she would seethe with envy if she found out that only Qween had seen her surprise. Maria turned around like lightning and glanced sideways at Qween, telling her to take care of the errand, and also telling Linda what they needed. Maria looked at the young lady intently and handed her the box. Linda looked at Maria in surprise and asked her for forgiveness as she did not understand what was being discussed. Maria looked at the maid intently and said with a smile that she seemed to be very upset because she trusted Qween with her little secret. Maria said that this was the reason Linda snapped at Qween. Maria asked if she was right. Linda, in turn, was burning with shame looking at the young lady. Maria smiled and said that that was why she thought she could confide in both of them. Since she also needed her advice, Linda timidly and embarrassedly asked the young lady for forgiveness. But a moment later, the maid froze in place. She looked intently at the contents of the box. She did not understand what it was. The young lady, in turn, was leisurely walking with her friend through the garden. Linda looked at her friend and apologized for her violent reaction. Maria, in turn, was very glad that she had managed to resolve the misunderstanding between them. She looked at her friend in surprise and asked what was the matter. Since she noticed that he was stubborn and did not want to go further, Glick sighed heavily and said that judging by the sounds they had guests. Glick looked sideways at the palace and said that they had better go back since he couldn't stand them. The young lady was surprised but said nothing. He pulled her along with him with lightning speed. The young lady in turn was in shock. She ran after him but asked him to walk more slowly. The young lady led her friend into the room. She sighed heavily when she closed the door as she was very tired. Her friend walked too fast and she could hardly keep up with him. A moment later, she heard someone calling her and turned around with a smile. The young man looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that it seemed to be her. Maria, in turn, froze in place from shock. He looked at her intently and said that he went to Adelath to find her, but when he got to Rose's house, she told her that the girl with red hair was called Maria. Gerard looked at the young lady intently and said with a grin that the rose was bad and just like a snake in the grass. He looked at her and said that her parents told him that Mary had gone on a journey, so he dropped everything and came back here just to meet her at the palace. The young lady, in turn, felt very awkward. She timidly asked him for forgiveness and said that she was very sorry since she did not mean to lie at all. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was all unimportant since the main thing now was that they were together again. The young lady said with a smile that it was so and also asked what brought him to the castle. Gerard looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he had come to see Ains. Maria looked at her friend in surprise and bewilderment. She hissed at him and said that he could not speak of the prince in such a manner. The young man looked at her in surprise and bewilderment, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Gerard looked at her with a smile and said that it was somehow awkward to observe such formalities being cousins. She looked at him intently and said that it didn't matter that they were brothers. He was the crown prince. A moment later, the young lady realized what he said and froze in place in shock as she did not expect them to be brothers. The crown prince looked closely at his brother and said with a smile that he looked very well. Gerard looked at his brother with a smile and said that he also looked great. The prince looked at him and asked with a smile what had taken him so long this time. Gerard said with a smile that he had met someone charming, and he thought it was Fate. Ains looked at his brother in surprise and asked if it was really that serious. He looked closely at his brother and said with a smile that it was because they had met again in the palace. The prince looked at his brother and with his soft smile said that he must know her. The prince asked who this girl was. Gerard looked closely at the prince and said that it was Maria. A moment later, the crown prince's expression changed, and he looked sullenly at his brother. Time flew by unnoticed, and the day of the ball had already arrived. The young lady, in turn, was slowly looking around the area, as she did not know that there was such a beautiful and charming place in the palace. A moment later, she heard someone calling her and turned around. The young lady looked at Maria intently and said with a smile that her name was Erica of the Highland clan. She said with a radiant smile that she was very pleased to meet her. Maria looked intently at the young lady as she realized whose daughter she was. Mary looked at her and asked if she was Lady Margaret's daughter. The young lady smiled and said that she was. Some time later, as they were chatting casually, Gerard noticed the young lady and looked at her intently. Maria, in turn, looked intently at Gerard. She did not understand why the Marquis addressed him, calling him His Highness. She thought that he was only a distant relative of the Crown Prince. Gerard slowly approached the young ladies and greeted them with a smile. Maria looked at her friend in surprise and said that she had no idea that he was a royal of such a high level. She looked at him excitedly and asked why he hadn't told her about it before. The young lady looked at the young men and said with a smile that they could chat later. Gerard looked at her closely and said that this was usually why people treated him differently, and he wanted her to see him as the simple man she met on the ship. Mary, in turn, was a little puzzled. She looked intently at her friend and said that they could dispense with formalities if he promised that he would not throw her into prison, or worse, execute her because of this. Gerard looked at her intently and said with a smile that he promised not to do that. A moment later, he saw the Crown Prince in the distance. The Crown Prince walked down slowly. He saw a young lady who was looking at him intently with a smile on her face. But he simply ignored her and slowly walked next to her. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback and froze in bewilderment. The Crown Prince approached the young lady and said with a smile that she looked beautiful today. He smiled and asked her permission to invite her to dance. Maria looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that it would be a great honor for her. Now she realized that the performance had begun. The prince looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile where her bird was. Maria looked at him and said that she just didn't want to give people another reason to stare at her. After a while, they slowly began to dance, everyone present looking at them intently. The prince looked at the young lady and said that if anyone wanted to ask her to dance, she could accept if she wished, but if she did not want to, she could calmly refuse, and she was under no obligation to anyone. He turned around with lightning speed and glanced sideways at her. A moment later, he said that if she still wanted to take a rest, she could go out onto the terrace. The young lady stood frozen in shock, wondering if he was just going to leave her alone. Gerard approached the young lady with lightning speed and with a radiant smile asked if she would dance with him. Maria was surprised as she did not expect him to approach her. She looked at him with a smile and said that she would dance with him at his own risk. She smiled and said that he needed to be prepared for her to trample all over his feet. Gerard smiled and said that he would be ready for that. The prince in turn looked intently and sullenly at the young people since he did not like this spectacle at all. Sometime later, the young lady decided to visit the terrace as she was very tired and needed a rest. She sat down and took off her shoes as her feet hurt terribly after dancing the whole evening. A moment later, she heard some noise and conversation outside the door. She looked at the door in surprise, wondering who it could be. A moment later, she saw the prince who had also come out onto the terrace. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he had come to rest. She knew that being stuck in a huge crowd with all eyes on you was quite a daunting experience. He looked at her in surprise and asked what was wrong with her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was just a little tired. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she was ready to go with him. Maria looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young lady in turn froze in place as she saw that the prince was about to jump from the balcony to the ground. She jumped up and stood on her feet. The young lady was in shock. Maria did not understand what he was doing at all. Mary looked at the prince intently and called him. She noticed that he was looking at her with a smile on his face while standing on the ground. The prince came a little closer to the balcony and stood up. He looked intently at Maria. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile on his face. He told her to jump as he would surely catch her. Maria froze in shock. She didn't understand what was happening at all. The young lady in turn listened to the prince and, trembling with fear, began to climb over. She closed her eyes and shouted to the prince that she was going to jump. The young lady ducked with lightning speed and landed right in the prince's arms. He looked at her with a smile. The prince smiled and said that everything was fine. She looked at him embarrassedly and said that he had caught her after all. He looked at her with a smile and said that he simply could not do otherwise. The young lady looked at the prince with an embarrassed smile and said that she had never thought that he would actually do such a thing. The young lady stood and watched the young men intently. She glared at them. The young lady was furious that the crown prince ignored her because of a commoner. Mary looked at the prince with a smile and said that they were finally here and she could give him a gift. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked what she had decided to give him. She looked at the prince with a smile and told him to unpack the box as soon as he returned to his chambers. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise. He didn't know when he had last experienced such joy from a gift. He was pleasantly embarrassed by her concern and simply beamed with happiness. The crown prince slowly opened the gift and froze in place with a puzzled expression on his face. Ines was puzzled and did not understand what kind of silk piece of fabric he was currently holding in front of him. A moment later, the prince saw a letter in the box. The prince slowly began to read the letter. The young lady in turn congratulated the prince on his birthday. She wrote that thanks to him, she felt wonderful and had a wonderful time with Glick. She hoped that she could bring him at least some benefit. Maria wrote that she had given him a gift and that he should wear it for sweet dreams. The prince, in turn, was very surprised and pleasantly embarrassed. The prince was very surprised because he did not expect that she would give him clothes for sleeping. The young lady, in turn, wrote that the clothes may look very strange, but he should try them on as they are very comfortable. The prince looked at his new pajamas with a smile and also ordered the servant to prepare a bath. He knew that he needed to try on the new gift as soon as possible. The young lady sat quietly enjoying the beautiful and calm morning. A moment later, a maid burst into the young lady's room and asked if she was awake. Maria looked at the maid in surprise, as she did not understand what the rush was about. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said that Her Majesty wished to see her right now. Mary looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she was sure about that. She was in shock and did not understand what was going on at all. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said that no matter how beautiful and wonderful Her Majesty was, there was something frightening about her, and for this reason she was very much afraid of her Maria. Vazdush in turn knew that Her Majesty's reputation spoke for itself and she was certainly fearsome. After some time, the young lady visited the empress. She bowed and said that it was a great honor for her to meet her. The empress looked intently at Maria and said that she hoped that she had caused her troubles to me already by giving the invitation. Maria was puzzled and did not understand why she was invited now, but wondered what was going on. She looked closely at the lady and noticed that Rosalia was also present. Maria looked at the empress and said with a smile that she had not caused her any trouble in any way. Maria smiled and said that it was a great honor for her to be here. A moment later, Maria froze in place as she saw the young lady's angry gaze on her. Maria bowed and told the empress that she could not come empty-handed and therefore asked her to accept a gift as her gratitude. Maria, in turn, did not know that it was customary for them to take a gift for the first official meeting, but she was very glad that Marilyn caught up with her in time and gave her the gift. Maria froze in place as she saw the young lady walking slowly towards her. She was puzzled and did not understand why she was approaching her. But a moment later, the young lady slapped Maria across the cheek with fury. Rosalia looked at Maria with fury and asked how she dared to humiliate her in front of all the people. Maria clenched her fists but didn't answer. The empress looked at the young lady intently and told her to control herself. Rosalia was shocked as she didn't expect the empress to say something like that. The empress looked at the young lady and said with a smirk that it was a complete disappointment that she was making such scenes. The empress looked at Maria and apologized to her instead of the young lady. Maria bowed and told the empress that she did not have to apologize to her. The empress looked at the young lady with a grin and said that it was very sweet of her since she was acting like a young lady. The empress looked at Maria intently and said that she had heard that she had managed to cure the panther. She was surprised and at the same time puzzled, as she had not expected that Maria would be the first person the crown prince would dance with. The empress looked at Maria with fury and asked if she understood what this meant. Maria, in turn, understood perfectly well what the empress actually said. The empress was furious and did not understand how Maria dared to do such a thing right under her nose. Maria looked intently at the empress and said with a smile that she understood her perfectly, but she could swear that she could not have imagined that he would invite her to dance. Sometime later, the young lady nevertheless left their society. She was slowly returning to her room but suddenly heard Rosalia call out to her and order her to stop. Maria was in shock. She knew that they would not let her go so easily. Rosalia swung her arm to hit her again, hitting the lady in the face. Maria turned around and asked the young lady if she really had no shame or conscience at all. Rosalia froze in shock as she had not expected to hear something like that. She looked at Maria in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Maria looked closely at the young lady and said that she had been invited as the royal veterinarian on the recommendation of Marquis Dimitri, and she had brought them a gift in strict accordance with protocol to show respect. Maria was shocked as the young lady was lulled into rage without even bothering to think about it. Maria walked closer to the young lady and asked with a smirk what would happen if the crown prince found out about this trait of hers. Maria looked intently at the young lady and said that it was very nice to meet her. Rosalia, in turn, was shaking with anger. Maria, in turn, looked at the young lady with a grin and said that, with her permission, she would go. Maria was puzzled because she did not understand why she had to endure such a thing. She was shocked and didn't understand why they hated her so much. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise, since she didn't expect to see her like this. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said that such a blow would leave a bruise and rumors would quickly spread. Maria looked at the maid in surprise and confusion and asked if everything was really that bad. Luri looked at Maria with concern and asked if she was okay. Maria smiled and said that she was fine. A moment later, the maid entered Mary's chambers and said that the crown prince had arrived to see her. Maria looked at the maid in surprise as she did not expect to hear something like that. The crown prince looked at the young lady intently. He was very disappointed with everything that had happened. He was very sorry that she still suffered because of him. Maria, in turn, was surprised she did not understand how he found out. She wondered if he really had his own people next to the empress. Qween came closer to the young lady and asked what happened to her face. He asked if the empress did this. The young lady was taken aback because he came too close to her. She was puzzled, said that it was not so. Qween sighed heavily and said that it looked like it was Rosalia. Maria looked away from the prince in embarrassment. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said with alarm that he would certainly see to it that she got double what she deserved. He knew that Mary did not deserve it and did not understand how she dared to do such a thing to her. Maria looked at the princess with a smile on her face and said that she was okay, but still she couldn't just silently endure it. Luri flew to her friend and sat on his head. Glick froze in place. A moment later, he looked at her puzzled and told her to get off immediately. Luri looked at her friend with a smile and asked why she had to do that. Glick shouted that he had just been shedding his fur and it had ruined everything. The prince looked closely at his friend and smiled to show the young lady that they were getting along well, and Mary smiled and said that they were. The prince glanced sideways at the young lady as he saw that she was still upset. The prince looked at the lady and called her. She looked at him in surprise because she did not understand why he was calling her. Qween asked if she would like to go for a walk or to the market with him. Some time later they were sitting in the tavern and having a pleasant conversation. She looked at the prince in surprise and asked why he had suddenly invited her to go with him. He looked at her and said with a smile that he had heard that she liked it. Yes, but it was her place. The young lady froze in place in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Qween looked at her and said that she could call him by his name when they were not in the palace. She looked at him in surprise and asked if she really could call him that. He smiled and said that of course she could only in places where no one knew who they really were. The young lady in turn beamed with joy and said with a smile that she agreed. She could see that he was trying very hard to cheer her up and even allowed her to call him by his first name to make her feel better. The young lady looked around and stared at the prince. She asked with a smile how he knew about this restaurant. He looked at her and said that he had often been there as a child. She looked closely at the prince and wondered as she was wondering if he was as handsome then as he is now. She knew it was quite possible. She assumed that all the girls in the kingdom were head over heels in love with him. Maria, for her part, thought that they were probably constantly arguing over him. She looked at the prince with a radiant smile and thought that he had certainly been cute as a child. The prince sighed heavily and said that he could see in her eyes what she was thinking. Some time later, as they were walking down the street, the young lady looked at the tent in surprise and asked the prince what kind of place it was. She saw that the sign said that this tent belonged to a fortune teller. The prince looked at the young lady and said that most people with such talent serve in temples, but there are those who prefer to work alone. The young lady thought for a moment and said that she understood everything. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she was intrigued. Maria, in turn, beamed with happiness. She said with a smile that of course she was very interested. A moment later they entered the tent. They were met by a beautiful lady. She smiled and asked them to come inside and to what they owed such an honor. She looked at them intently and asked with a smile if they really wanted to know their future. Maria smiled, looking at the fortune teller, and asked with a smile what she could tell her. The fortune teller looked closely at the ball and said that she would like to look at it. Maria, in turn, was amazed as she saw that the ball began to shine. The fortune teller sighed heavily and said that this was very strange. She looked closely at the young lady and said that unfortunately she could not see anything. Maria looked at the fortune teller in surprise and asked if this was true. The prince looked sideways at Maria, wondering if she really had no future. After their walk together, the prince returned to his study and with lightning speed began studying the books. A little worried, yes, but the situation was so I knew that I pretended that nothing terrible had happened. He looked at the young lady closely and worried her but told her not to take it to heart. Maria said with a smile that everything was fine and he did not need to worry. He knew that according to historical records, if a fortune teller cannot see a person's future, there can only be two reasons for this. Either the person has angered the goddess and therefore the fortune teller cannot see his fate, or the goddess values this person so much that she hides his future from prying eyes. The book also mentions people who came from other worlds, and the goddess especially protects them. The prince thought for a moment as he thought that the young lady might be one of them. The maid looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she had received mail. The young lady thanked the maid for bringing her the letters. The maid said that she received letters from 2 different senders. Maria looked at our letter with surprise because she knew that the first one must be from Uncle Jackie. She saw who the second letter was from. Maria was shocked and did not understand why she was sent a letter. The maid sighed heavily and said that she herself also did not understand why it came to her, and she herself was very interested. Maria thanked Linda with a smile for bringing them. She said that she would certainly read the letters and let me know if she needed anything. The maid smiled and said that she would be very happy to help the young lady. Maria knew that she would read the letter from her uncle first. They asked how she was doing and also said that they were doing well. They wanted her to come home soon and wrote that they were waiting for her very much and that Rosa was also waiting for her with impatience. The young lady was very glad that everything was fine with them. But unfortunately, she very much doubted that her sister missed her. She slowly moved towards the second letter, which frightened her very much. Maria was puzzled and did not understand what the young lady was trying to achieve and what her plans were. She wondered if they had not done enough. Maria was worried and did not understand why they continued to ruin her life. In the letter, she read that the young lady's puppy was sick and she urgently needed her help. Maria, in turn, decided to visit the young lady in order to look at her pet. She was a little puzzled as she knew she shouldn't expect gratitude, but she was shocked that the lady made her come and wait and stared at her. Rosalia looked at the puppy and told Maria that he had diarrhea and was refusing to eat. Maria, in turn, looked intently at the puppy who was trembling with fear. She came closer to him and asked for forgiveness, asked his permission to examine him. She was a little excited because she smelled the smell and realized that he had just vomited. She looked at him intently and greeted him. Maria was excited. She told the little dog that her owner was very worried about him, and she also asked what he ate last time. He said that he ate chicken with bread. She looked at him in surprise and asked if that was all. The young lady was puzzled as she did not understand what was causing his poor health. He said that the dish smelled strange, but he ate it anyway as he was very hungry. He sighed heavily and, puzzled, said that this had been going on for several days. The food looked unpleasant, but he was very hungry, and so he had to eat it all. The young lady looked at him and asked if this woman was his mistress. He said that she was not, and his mistress's name was Elena. Maria looked at the young lady intently, as she knew that Elena was Rosalia's sister. Maria was shocked and wondered how she could do such a thing to her sister's puppy. Maria looked at the young lady intently and said that you can't feed a puppy stale bread and rotten chicken. Rosalia looked at Maria in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The lady didn't understand why she would do such a thing. Maria told the young lady that all the symptoms pointed to poisoning from spoiled food. Maria asked if they were in financial difficulties, that they could not afford normal food. Maria said that even the poorest peasants did not feed their pets scraps. Rosalia was shocked. She jumped up and looked at Maria with fury, as she did not understand how she dared to say such a thing. Maria looked at the lady intently and told her not to even try to deny this fact. As she was an expert in this field, Maria said with fury that she would not get away with such treatment of an animal. Maria looked at the young lady intently and said that she would definitely find out everything about what had happened. She looked at the lady with fury and asked if it was really her dog. Rosalia, worried and puzzled, looked at Maria and told her to cast aside her stupid suspicions and accusations. She must immediately cure the dog. Maria looked at the lady and asked if she should treat Lady Elena's dog. Rosalia froze in place from shock. Since she did not expect to hear such a thing, Maria looked sideways at the maid and asked if she could inform Lady Elena about everything. The maid said that she would definitely do everything. Maria said that she would give the medicine for the puppy, and they could feed him some soup for now, preferably not too thick. She asked to return the pet to its rightful owner, and if someone tried to steal it again, she should know about it. Maria said that she had a letter written by Rosalia to prove her guilt. The maid slowly approached the puppy and said that she understood everything. Rosalia in turn looked intently at the maid and told her to wait. Maria looked sideways at the young lady and told her not to stand in her way, as she would come again to make sure that the animal was completely healthy. Maria said of the young lady that if she doubted her abilities, she looked forward to the visit. Maria said that Glick was one of her favorite patients, and he would be very happy to spend time with her in a fun conversation. Rosalia was very puzzled because she understood that if anyone found out that she stole her sister's pet, then her reputation in her family would come to an end. She understood that this meant that she would not see the throne, and they would very quickly find a replacement for her. The young lady was furious. She did not understand how a mere commoner dared to treat her like that. She screamed furiously that the young lady would pay for this insult. The prince looked at his brother and said that it was very unexpected. He asked when he planned to leave. Gerard sighed heavily and said that he was going to leave him tomorrow morning. The prince was surprised as he did not expect his brother to leave so soon. Gerard smiled and said that he couldn't believe that he had to leave when he met Maria again after so much time. The prince frowned at his words. Gerard looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that he would not take her with him to the new British lands. Gerard asked his brother if he could let her rest a little. The prince looked at his brother in surprise and asked why he suddenly started talking about this. Gerard told his brother that the young lady could only communicate with the family by correspondence. The prince looked closely at his brother and said that he himself would certainly resolve the issue with Maria and he should concentrate on the trip. Gerard looked at his brother and said with a smile that if he really wanted the best for her, then he should offer her something more. He said that she should not limit herself to working as his personal veterinarian. The prince looked at his brother and told him to stop saying such things. Since he knew very well what Gerard felt for her, Ains said that for this reason, he advised him to stop and throw such thoughts out of his head. The prince looked at his brother and asked if he could do it. Gerard looked at his brother with a smile and said that he understood him and also said that the prince was forgetting something. Gerard looked at his brother and said that in the entire empire, there was only one man outside his control, and he was standing right in front of him now. The prince looked at his brother with a grin and said that this was not an order but a warning. The young lady looked at her friend intently and said that he was leaving so suddenly that she did not even have time to prepare a suitable gift for him. She looked at him with a special smile and wished him a good journey. He looked at her with a smile and said that he had specially told her everything at the last moment so that she wouldn't have to think about a gift. Gerard looked away from her and said that he was still very upset that their paths were diverging so soon. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her with a smile and said that she didn't need to take what he said to heart and that they would definitely see each other soon. A moment later, he handed her the box and said it was a gift for her. Maria looked at it and asked what it was. He said with a smile that it was his parting gift to her. The young lady was excited. She looked at him intently and asked if he was serious. She said that unfortunately, she didn't even have anything for him. Gerard looked at her intently and said that it was nothing special and she should open it. The young lady froze in shock. She asked her friend in confusion why he was giving her something so precious. He smiled and said that he knew that any jewelry would look good on her. He looked at her with a smile and pulled out the bag of motion sickness pills he had given her earlier. Smiling as he said that they seemed to work well, the young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he still remembered this. Gerard gave her a soft smile and said that of course he remembered everything connected with her. She looked at him in surprise and said with a smile that he was simply the most wonderful friend. Gerard was shocked. He wondered how many times she would say the word friend. Gerard looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he had one more gift for her, but she would receive it later, and the prince would give it to her. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise, as she did not expect the prince to give her a gift as well. Gerard smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that he thought she could use some rest, so he asked the prince to give her a few days off. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked if that was true. Luri looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she looked very happy. She asked what had happened and where Maria was going. Maria looked at her friend with a smile and said that she was on vacation and was planning to go home for a while. Luri Wu smiled and said that it sounded very wonderful. The young lady was surprised because at first she thought that Gerard was joking, so she needed to make sure of his words. but she was very surprised when it turned out that he really was not joking. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if Gerard had really told her that. She smiled and said that it was so. She said with a smile that Gerard had told her that the prince was giving her a few days off. She looked at the prince in surprise as she did not understand his reaction. She looked at the prince in surprise, and about the task she said that if he needed her here, then she would not mind staying. The prince sighed heavily and said that he had indeed planned to give her some time to rest. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he just wanted to tell her this in person. Maria froze in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. For a moment, it seemed to her that the prince did not want to let her go. She was a little puzzled as it did not give her peace, but she knew that she would still go home. A moment later, she was informed that the prince was entering her chambers. Mary looked at the door in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that she must take everything with her. She looked at him and his task in surprise, but asked what was going on. He looked at her intently and said that these were all her gifts. The young lady thanked him for the task. She said that unfortunately there were a lot of them, and she wasn't sure she could bring them all to term, even if she became a stallion. The young lady looked at the prince and said that she wished she was as strong as him, but unfortunately she was not. He looked at her and said that he would definitely go with her and help her. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked why he was doing this. The prince sighed heavily and said that he had long wanted to visit the neighboring territories, so she could consider this a vacation for him too. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that she understood him, and she also said that it was very wonderful since it would be difficult for her to bring these gifts on her own. He sat down next to her and asked with a smile what was good about her city. She looked at him with a smile and said that in her home region there are beautiful beaches, mountains, and also a city square. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she would be his guide. Sometime later they both traveled. She could not believe that she was finally able to return to her native land. The prince looked at the young lady intently. He wanted to be the man who would always be by her side, and with whom she would smile so radiantly. He was puzzled because he understood that his father was convincing him to marry Rosalia. She looked at the prince with a smile and told him to look out the window as there was a beautiful view. She looked at him in surprise and asked what happened as he looked very upset. Mary looked at the prince intently and asked if he was sad that his brother was gone. The prince sighed heavily and said that he was not. The prince looked at the young lady and called her. She looked at his excited face in surprise. The prince asked how she would react if he said that he was getting married. She looked at him in surprise as she did not expect such a question. The young lady thought for a moment. Then her face changed with lightning speed and she said with a smile that she would congratulate him with all her heart. The prince sighed heavily and said that he understood her. He felt a little sad from her words. The maid looked at the young lady trembling with fear and said that she had been told so. The young lady looked at the maid intently and asked if they were both heading to the commoner's hometown. The maid, trembling with fear, looked at the lady and said that it was so as the man who works in the palace told her. The young lady in turn said with fury that all the time the reason why he turned his nose up at her was Maria. She looked at the maid and told her to give the vein to the empress, that she would definitely get rid of this obstacle. The prince thought for a moment. He wondered how she could say something like that to him. He knew that she would not have said such a thing if she had only known how he felt about her. He looked at the young lady intently and wondered how she could be so sweet. A moment later, the carriage ran over a stone and the young lady woke up. She looked out the window in surprise and joy as they had finally arrived. The prince looked sideways at the young lady and said that he would have someone carry them in the luggage. He said that she could start unpacking and rest, but he had some things to do. He said that he would return to her soon. Maria looked at him intently and said with a smile that she had smelled it, but to me later she said that she seemed to have dozed off a little. She asked if she had really caused him any inconvenience. The prince looked away from the young lady in embarrassment and said that she had not caused him any inconvenience and that everything was fine. Madame looked at all the gifts in surprise. She was in shock, as she did not expect to see something like this. Sir looked puzzled at the best silk he had ever seen. Maria looked at them closely and said with a smile that they were gifts from her employer. The young lady approached Maria and asked how they knew that she had not stolen all of it. Maria was surprised and looked at her sister in shock and asked what she was talking about. Maria sighed heavily and looked at Rose sullenly. She said that she had never stolen anything. Rose looked at Maria with a grin and said that then she became the mistress of some rich man. She did not understand how some aristocrat would shower gifts on an ordinary commoner who simply worked for her. The Sir looked at his daughter and told her not to talk to her sister like that. Madame sighed heavily and said that they were very grateful for all the gifts, but this was too generous on her part. Mary looked at them intently and said with a smile that everything was fine. She said that she had worked very well, so her mistress had generously given her gifts. Mentally, she asked the prince for forgiveness. Her parents thought that she was working for a rich lady. Maria looked at her parents and said with a smile that her mistress was very beautiful, graceful, and elegant. The lady breathed a sigh of relief, looked at her daughter, and told her to convey their sincere gratitude to her. Meanwhile, Rose took the box with the gift and said that she was leaving. Maria looked closely at her sister, as she always initially picked on her and then took away all the most valuable things. Some time later, the young lady was sleeping quietly in bed with her friend. In the meantime, I had a very terrible nightmare. She shivered and frowned as she did not understand where she was. She was very confused. She was alarmed as an eerie feeling came over her. She turned around and saw a fire flare up behind her. With the speed of lightning, she rushed to run. Maria was scared and wanted to get out quickly. A moment later, she saw an exit and a light in the distance. She stared at the exit and wondered if she could reach it. But a moment later, she tripped and fell to the ground with a crash. The young lady sighed heavily and woke up from a terrible nightmare. Her friend looked at her intently and asked if she had had a bad dream. The young lady in turn sighed heavily. She said that unfortunately she had had the same nightmare again as before. She said puzzledly that maybe it was the room. Maria said that maybe some evil entity had taken up residence there while she was gone. Her friend said that he had seen several beetles. Maria sighed heavily as goosebumps ran down her spine. Some time later, she started cleaning and found a book under the bed. She was surprised because she saw that she had found a truly real find. She looked closely at the diary that belonged to the real Marie. She was surprised and wondered if Marie was a priestess, a dose of courage. She was surprised because she knew that not everyone can become a priest, and for this you need to be born with certain abilities. She heard that it takes years of training and a person dedicates his whole life to God. She knew that Marie was far from this. The young lady in turn raised that it would be better for her to ask about it herself. The madam looked closely at the young lady and said that she was a priestess in the past. She sighed heavily and said that unfortunately she had lost her abilities and connection with the higher powers. She said that for this reason she had to give up the business, but one day she had a dream that turned out to be prophetic. The young lady looked at her in surprise and asked what kind of dream it was. The madam looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she had dreamed how she appeared in their house. Madam said that the young lady in the dream had grown up to be as cheerful and wonderful as she is now. The young lady looked at us at the Dan and asked what she meant. Madame looked intently at the night and said that she knew that she was being tormented by nightmares, and perhaps higher powers were showing her a vision of future events, and this was a sign that they were protecting her. Maria looked at Madame in surprise since she did not understand what she was talking about. Madame looked closely at the young lady and said that she was sure that they opened up more to those who were dear to them. She said that sometimes the introductions can be not very pleasant, as pointed out by the bitter truth. The young lady sighed heavily and said that frankly she was not sure. She wondered if there was a divine being who loved her. She was surprised and confused, and also wondered if this was why she came to this world. At the estate of Lord Adelata, an unexpected guest arrived. The Lord looked at the guest and asked what he owed to such an honor. She looked closely at the portrait and said that it was truly beautiful. She looked at the Lord intently and asked if it was true that he was obsessed with red-haired girls. She said that there were rumors that he preferred red-haired concubines because they reminded him of his mother. He looked at her in surprise and said that it was just a rumor. The young lady looked at the Lord intently and said that she was here to help him. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to receive help from her. She smiled and said that she knew a beautiful red-haired girl, and she just really wanted to get rid of her. The Lord looked at her in surprise and asked how he could help her. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he did not understand at all what she wanted from him. The young lady in turn looked at him intently with a fuss on her face. She said that he did not need to worry since she already had people who would take care of this matter. The young lady looked closely at the Lord and with a satisfied grin said that her boys would bring this red-haired girl to him. At the same time, Maria was leisurely walking around the city. After reading the diary and talking to Madame, she became deeply confused in her thoughts. She sighed heavily, but a moment later she thought that since she was at the market, she might as well buy something tasty for dinner. She looked at her friend and asked, "How about some fresh bread?" He smiled and said that was a great idea. A moment later she saw that there was one last loaf of bread left, and she joyfully ran towards it at full speed. The young lady rushed towards her with her lightning speed, but suddenly froze. As she saw that someone had taken her away right in front of her, she was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing at all. She saw a young man who was looking at her with a smirk. She froze looking at the prince as she was confused and could not understand if it was really him. A moment later she said that it was not so and that she must be imagining things from fatigue. The young man looked at the young lady with embarrassment. She looked at the prince in surprise and asked if he had already finished his business. Ains looked at her and said that he had just returned and dismissed the servants as they needed to gain strength. The prince looked at the young lady and said that they had a long journey ahead of them, so this was their only chance to have a good rest. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked if this meant that he had never managed to finish what he had intended to do, and was now hanging around doing nothing. The prince looked at her intently, and sighing heavily said that this was the case. The young lady looked at the prince with joy and asked, "How about having dinner with her family tonight?" She smiled and asked if he had time. Maria looked closely at the prince and said with a smile that her parents would be very happy to see him. The prince froze in shock as he did not expect to hear something like that. Madame looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that they were very glad to see him. Sir smiled and said that they had received wonderful gifts from the lady. The prince looked at his girlfriend's parents with bewilderment and thanked them for the invitation with a smile. But a moment later, he looked at them in surprise and asked which lady they were talking about. Maria was shocked as she understood that he was going to screw everything up now. She interrupted him with lightning speed and with a puzzled smile said that they must hurry as the food would soon get cold. Sir looked at the young people with puzzlement and said that they must be very hungry and should help themselves immediately. Rose looked intently at the young people. Maria became wary looking at her sister. She upset Rose very much when she turned 5. She began to feel her presence more and more from then on. Maria began to irritate her, and this continued to this day. She was always calm and collected, unlike Rose, and even when she tore up her books or stole food from her, she still remained calm. Rose looked at her sister with fury and shouted at her to give her the book back. Maria looked at her sister with a smile and said that of course she could take a book from there. Rose knew that they always liked Maria more than her, and this caused her unbearable pain. When the young lady was only 10 years old, she fell in love for the first time with Peter, who was her age. But unfortunately, the sweet boy fell in love not with her, but with her sister. Rose was very hurt by this, and for this reason she hated Maria even more. Rose continued to pester her sister, spending her secret savings and stealing her dresses. But Maria remained calm, and instead of getting angry, she just smiled. Maria looked up and said that it might be too dangerous because it was so high. Rose looked at her sister and asked, what kind of sister was she if she couldn't do this for her? Rose shouted at her sister that she had to prove that she cared. But a moment later, the young lady slipped off the ladder and fell to the ground with a crash. She lost consciousness, having hit her head very hard. The young lady spent some time near her sister caring for her, but in turn, Rose wanted her sister not to wake up. After that incident, Maria began to behave strangely, as if she had become a different person. She demanded that the housework be divided equally and stopped indulging Rose. And a couple of months later, she suddenly went on a trip. Rose looked at the young men closely and said that she was sure that Maria would eventually find some rich old man and become his mistress, or she would end up serving in some shabby tavern. The young man looked at Rose intently and said with a grin that her sister had returned with a wealthy and handsome nobleman and that the owner of the place where she worked loved her very much. The young lady in turn screamed that this really pissed her off. The young man looked at her intently and said with a smirk that she should do something because otherwise Maria would always look down on her. The young man said with a grin that he knew what she needed to do. Rose looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The next morning, the young lady sat quietly pondering her next steps. She wondered if her plan would work. Rose was excited and did not know what was best for her to do. They looked at her intently and said with smirks on their faces, "They are not putting pressure on her, and she has nothing to lose anymore." Maria looked at her sister in surprise and asked what had happened as her behavior was not typical of her. Rose looked closely at the young lady and asked where their precious guest was. Maria told her sister that her friend had important business to attend to, so he had to leave. Maria looked at her sister in surprise and asked why she needed him. Rose looked at her sister with a smile and asked if she wanted to go to the market with her. Rose smiled and said that she needed to buy something, and for this she would need her sister's help. Rose said that she really liked a guy, and she would like to buy him a present. Maria looked at her sister in surprise and asked if she was really asking her for help. Maria looked at her sister and asked if she had any ideas for what to give. Rosa sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, she had no ideas yet. Maria looked at the young lady and asked what the young man she liked was interested in. Rose sighed heavily and said that she didn't know, so she would just take the first thing she saw. Maria looked at her sister in surprise as everything seemed very strange to her. A moment later, they entered the shop and started looking at various trinkets. Maria offered various goods to her sister, but she refused them all. Maria wondered in confusion if this was some new kind of humiliation. A moment later, the young lady finally decided on a gift. Maria looked at her sister in surprise and asked if she was serious about choosing this. Rose looked at her sister and asked if she had taken the money insistently. Maria was surprised as she had not expected such a thing. She looked at her sister and asked if she really had to pay. Rose looked at her sister intently and said that she should pay for the gift. Maria was shocked by this. She sighed heavily and went up to the cellar and paid for the goods. Some time later, they entered their hut. Maria looked around in surprise and asked her sister if she was really supposed to meet the young man in this hut. She was shocked by the place of their meeting. Rose timidly said that everything was exactly like that and he should come here soon. She in turn was very nervous. A moment later, the young lady looked at her sister and said that unfortunately she had forgotten to take the letter with her. Maria looked at her sister in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Maria asked her sister in surprise if she should go get the letter too. Maria thought that her sister would send her to get it now. Rose shouted furiously that she shouldn't do this. She was worried that things might not go according to plan. Maria was taken aback as she did not expect such a reaction from her sister. She did not understand why she was behaving so strangely. Rose looked away from her sister and said that she didn't trust her because she might read the letter on the way. She couldn't stand it when someone came into her room. She turned around with lightning speed and said that she would go get the letter herself. Maria looked at her sister in surprise but still shouted after her to be careful and not slip, otherwise she would fall. Maria looked after her in surprise. She wondered why her sister was in such a hurry. The young lady sat in the hut and waited for her sister. She was a little worried because she had been gone for a long time. She opened the door and looked into the distance because she thought that her sister had slipped and fallen. But a moment later, she froze in place as she saw many men in front of her. Meanwhile, the young lady was running away from the hut in a hurry. Rose realized that she needed to run as far away as possible. The young men looked at the young lady and told her to go and say what she wanted. The young lady in turn said in a trembling voice that she did not want Maria to be hurt. The Lord looked at the young lady and said that he would just frighten her and would do nothing more to her. He told the rose that she should not worry. The young lady beamed with happiness. He looked at her closely and said with a grin that she should help them since someone had to lure her to them. She knew that they were always arguing with Maria. But suddenly, she became sweet and friendly. She wondered if her sister was really stupid that she didn't notice the trick. She mentally said that her sister herself was to blame for everything. The young lady froze in place. She was worried because she trusted her friends with this joke, but she wondered if these rumors about the Lord were true. She was worried that her sister might be hurt very badly. She turned around with lightning speed and wondered if the truth was even worse. The young lady became very worried. She hoped that everything would be fine with her sister. She did not want anything terrible to happen to Maria. She was very worried because she just wanted to scare her, and that's all. The young lady froze in place in surprise as someone grabbed her. She tried to break free, but it was all in vain. Mary looked at those present and asked what was going on. The Lord looked at the young lady and said that she would become his third wife. Maria was shocked by this statement. She looked closely at the man and asked what he was talking about. He looked at his men and told them with a smirk on his face to bring her to him. He knew the fun was about to begin. At the same time, the man was carrying a young lady on his shoulder who was screaming and demanding to be let go, but all her attempts to free herself were unsuccessful. Maria was shocked when she saw the man carrying her sister on his shoulder. Rose looked at her sister guiltily and called her. She was glad that nothing happened to her sister, but at the same time she was worried. The Lord looked at the young lady intently and said that if she refused to be his wife, then her sister would certainly suffer. He was sure that he would easily break her, and she would become his new wife. Maria looked at the Lord in surprise and asked why he would involve Rose in this at all. He looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked why she didn't ask her herself. He said with a smirk that the young lady could answer that question herself. Maria looked at Rose in shock and asked what he was talking about. She couldn't believe that her sister was involved in the kidnapping. The young lady in turn clenched her teeth tightly but said nothing. She was very angry as she was backed against the wall. Maria was shocked and couldn't believe it. Lord looked at Maria with a grin and asked what was the matter. She looked at the Lord intently and said with fury that no matter how he tried to intimidate her, she would never become his third wife. He looked at her with a satisfied grin and said that he would definitely make her fall to her knees and beg for it. He knew perfectly well that under his pressure, she would not last long and would soon surrender to him. 2 days after the abduction, they were sitting in a damp dungeon from which, unfortunately, there was no exit. Maria walked around the dungeon excitedly, as she was constantly looking for a way out. Rose looked sideways at her sister and said that it was really her fault. Maria told her to sit quietly. Maria looked sideways at her sister and said that she had to do something. Maria looked intently beyond the bars and did not ask if there was anyone there. She used her power to contact someone. She was very puzzled because she realized that there were no animals nearby. She really hoped to get at least some help from them, but unfortunately, everything was in vain. A moment later, she turned around as she heard some noise. She froze when she saw a lord and a servant heading towards them. The lord came closer to him and looked at the young ladies with a grin. He asked with a grin if they were still holding on, and he slowly moved the plate of food towards them. The Lord looked at Maria and said that he liked her because she was a girl with their character. He said with a grin that he would tame such a thing. It would be even more pleasant. The young lady in turn shuddered from shock. As he left, he said that she should tell him when she got tired of hanging around behind bars and choking on filthy swill. Maria slowly walked up to her sister and handed her a plate of food. Rose lowered her gaze to the ground. In shame, she asked Maria why she was giving her food. She did not understand why Maria was so kind to her after everything she had done to her. Rose screamed furiously that it was entirely her fault. She screamed at Maria to stop being so kind to her. Maria looked at her intently and did not say that she had suspected her for a long time. Maria asked her sister why she did it. Maria wanted to know from her sister why she had to act so stupidly. Maria did not understand what she had done to her sister to deserve such treatment. Rose said with a trembling voice that it was because she had always been that perfect girl that everyone adored. She said that she was very tired of people constantly comparing them. She said that her parents loved her very much and were only proud of Maria, and they paid no attention to Rose. Rose looked at Maria with tears in her eyes and said that she really hoped that she would not come back in the ambulance. Rose told Maria that she did not intend to harm her, keep her locked up, or send her somewhere forever. Rose screamed that she was deceived. Maria looked at her sister with fury and asked if all this had happened. Because of these stupid things, Maria furiously told her sister that she was very disappointed in her. Rose froze in shock and from her sister's icy gaze, as it was the first time she had seen her like this. At the same time, their parents sat and grieved bitterly because they could not help their children. They were very upset. Sir was very puzzled. He wondered who could have done this. He was in shock and did not know where to look for his daughters now. The madam looked at her husband and did not say that this must be the work of the Lord, since only he could do such a thing. She said with tears in her eyes that she had asked him for a meeting, but unfortunately he kept refusing and postponing. She knew that it was he who had done it. A moment later, the prince knocked on their door. He entered and greeted his husband, and also said that he had been waiting for Mary, but she had not come. The lady looked at the young man with surprise and bewilderment. She hoped that he would certainly do something against the Lord. She ran up to him with lightning speed and said that unfortunately they had bad news. She said that their children were missing. The prince looked at Madame in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked at the young man and did not say that she thought they had been kidnapped by that famous perverted aristocrat. She burst into bitter words and said that, unfortunately, it was not in their power to try to convince him to let their daughters go. The young lady in turn was puzzled, since 3 days had already passed since their abduction. She looked closely at her sister. Since the rose itself had brewed everything, and now she was also sick. Maria was very worried and did not know what to do. She understood that she had to find a way out of this situation. Maria looked closely at her sister and asked how long she had been feeling this way. Rose sighed heavily and said that she did not know. Mary screamed furiously and asked for help. She said that her sister was very ill. She was very angry because no one responded to her call for help. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that her screams would not lead to anything good. She had already used all the medicines they had given her, but there was no use in them. Rose muttered quietly and did not tell her sister to leave her and think better of herself. Maria looked closely at the rose and said that she would not go anywhere without her since she could not do such a thing. She said that they were stuck in a dungeon together and she herself knew because of whom all this happened. Maria sighed heavily and said that they needed to stop this because they couldn't fight. She sighed heavily and said that there were more important things than that. With lightning speed, she began to examine her meticulous prison. She was in shock because she understood that there was no way out of the dungeon and nothing would help them escape. She exhaled heavily and decided to try using her power again. The young lady quietly concentrated. Using her power over a long distance, she asked if there was anyone nearby. She asked for help and also asked if she could be heard. Maria hoped that her spell would work this time. A moment later, the rose screamed very loudly. Maria was puzzled and did not understand why her sister suddenly started screaming. Maria looked at her sister in surprise and asked, "What was the matter?" Rose, trembling with fear, said that something had just rushed past her. A moment later, the young ladies saw a beautiful mouse who was staring at them. Rose was in shock. She screamed and asked her sister to get the rat away from her as soon as possible. Maria looked at her sister with bailiff-like eyes and told her to behave quietly. Maria, with a radiant smile, approached the mouse and greeted her. The mouse in turn looked intently at the young lady and did not ask how she dared to interrupt her sleep. She asked if it was really impossible to be quieter. Maria looked at the mouse intently and said that she needed to ask her for a favor. She looked at the lady and said that she would go and sleep somewhere else as she had somewhere to go. Maria looked at her puzzled and said that was not what she meant at all. She said that she wanted to ask her for help,